This is the complete story of the Sumerians and the Bronze Age peoples who followed them, a tale spanning 4,000 years of triumph, innovation, warfare, collapse, and rebirth that echoes through every civilization that came after. Before we begin this journey together, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? As the great ice sheets that had dominated the northern hemisphere for millennia began their slow, inexorable retreat around 10,000 BCE, the world itself seemed to exhale after an age-long winter, and nowhere was this transformation more dramatic than in the region we now call Mesopotamia. The massive glaciers that had locked away vast quantities of the world's water slowly released their frozen treasures, causing sea levels to rise and weather patterns to shift in ways that would reshape entire landscapes and ultimately the course of human history itself. Where once harsh, arid steppes had stretched endlessly under cold skies, a different world began to emerge, one where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved deeper channels through increasingly fertile soil, where seasonal flooding deposited rich, alluvial sediments across expanding floodplains, and where the climate grew warmer and more predictable with each passing century. This wasn't merely a change in weather. It was the planet itself creating the perfect laboratory for humanity's most ambitious experiment. Picture the landscape as it appeared to those early peoples around 6500 BCE, vast marshlands, stretching to every horizon, teeming with fish, waterfowl and wild game, while date palms and other fruit trees grew abundantly along the riverbanks. Reed beds swayed in gentle breezes, providing not only shelter for countless species of birds and animals, but also the raw materials that would soon become humanity's first architectural innovations. The soil, enriched by thousands of years of flooding and organic deposits, seemed to promise abundance to anyone bold enough to scratch beneath its surface. The people who first recognized this promise were descendants of hunter-gatherer bands who had roamed the region for generations, following seasonal migrations of animals and gathering wild plants, according to ancient rhythms their ancestors had perfected over countless millennia. But something began to change in their relationship with the land during these crucial centuries. Perhaps it started with a few families who noticed that the wild wheat and barley growing near the rivers produced more abundant harvests in certain locations. Or maybe it began when someone observed that scattered seeds from their food stores sprouted into thriving plants near their temporary campsites. Whatever sparked the initial insight, the transformation that followed would prove to be one of humanity's most consequential discoveries. These early pioneers began to establish the world's first permanent settlements, choosing locations where the annual flood cycles were predictable enough to support agriculture, but not so violent as to wash away their increasingly sophisticated dwellings. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Es-Sarwan and Chogamami reveals communities that were far more complex and organized than anything that had existed before settlements, where families lived in rectangular mud brick houses arranged in deliberate patterns, where communal storage facilities held surplus grain against future seasons, and where the first tentative experiments in irrigation began to supplement the natural flood cycles. The agricultural revolution that unfolded during the Ubaid period represented nothing less than a complete reimagining of humanity's relationship with the natural world. Instead of simply taking what nature provided, these early farmers learned to partner with the rivers themselves, constructing simple but effective irrigation channels that could direct floodwater to fields during the growing season and store it in reservoirs for use during drier months. They developed sophisticated techniques for preparing soil, selecting seeds, timing plantings to coincide with optimal weather conditions, and harvesting crops in ways that maximized both immediate yields and future productivity. But agriculture alone cannot explain the remarkable transformations that occurred during the Ubaid period. Equally important was the development of new technologies that allowed these growing communities to process, store, and transport their agricultural surpluses more effectively than ever before. Master potters began creating increasingly sophisticated ceramic vessels, not just simple bowls and storage jars, but elaborate serving pieces decorated with intricate geometric patterns that reveal both artistic sensibility and technical expertise. The pottery from this period shows a level of craftsmanship that suggests specialized artisans were already emerging within these early communities. People whose primary occupation was creating beautiful and functional objects rather than producing food directly. These ceramic innovations had profound implications that extended far beyond their immediate practical applications. Pottery allowed for better food storage, which meant communities could maintain larger grain reserves and thus support larger populations through difficult seasons. Decorated vessels served important social functions, allowing families and communities to display their prosperity and artistic achievements during ceremonies and celebrations. Most importantly, the techniques required for successful pottery production, understanding clay composition, controlling firing temperatures, managing complex multi-step processes, represented a new kind of human knowledge that required formal teaching and learning, creating some of humanity's earliest educational traditions. As these communities grew larger and more prosperous, they began to develop increasingly sophisticated religious and ceremonial practices that would profoundly influence all subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. The earliest temples from the Ubaid period were simple structures, often built on slightly elevated platforms to protect them from flooding, but their basic architectural principles, rectangular sanctuaries oriented according to astronomical observations, separate areas for different types of rituals, storage facilities for religious offerings, would remain consistent features of Mesopotamian religious architecture for thousands of years to come. These early religious innovations reflected humanity's growing understanding that successful agricultural communities required not just technical expertise, but also social cohesion and shared beliefs that could unite diverse families and clans under common purposes. The deities worshipped during the Ubaid period appear to have been primarily concerned with fertility and abundance. Gods and goddesses who controlled the flooding rivers ensured successful harvests, protected livestock, and blessed human families with children who would carry on their community's traditions and knowledge. Archaeological evidence from Ubaid period sites reveals increasingly clear signs of social stratification, suggesting that these early agricultural communities were already developing the complex hierarchies that would characterize all subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. Some houses were significantly larger and more elaborate than others, containing luxury goods like imported obsidian tools, elaborate jewelry, and finely crafted ceremonial objects that indicate their owners possessed both wealth and high social status. Communal buildings served functions that required sophisticated coordination and planning, suggesting that formal leadership roles were emerging to manage increasingly complex community activities. The development of long-distance trade networks during the Ubaid period represents perhaps the most remarkable achievement of these early agricultural pioneers. Evidence from excavations reveals that communities separated by hundreds of miles were exchanging not just practical goods like metal tools and exotic stones, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that would spread throughout the region and beyond. Obsidian from Anatolian volcanoes found its way into Mesopotamian villages, while Mesopotamian pottery styles influenced ceramic traditions as far away as the Persian Gulf and the Zagros Mountains. These trade networks required more than just the production of surplus goods. They demanded the development of sophisticated systems for transportation, communication, and standardization that would become increasingly important as Mesopotamian civilizations grew more complex. Boats designed specifically for river navigation began appearing during this period, along with standardized weights and measures that allowed traders from different communities to conduct business efficiently and fairly. Most importantly, the relationships established during the Ubaid period created the foundation for the cultural exchanges that would eventually spread Mesopotamian innovations throughout the ancient world. The artistic achievements of Ubaid period communities reveal a level of aesthetic sophistication that surprises many people who assume that early agricultural societies must have been primarily concerned with simple survival. Pottery from this era displays intricate geometric patterns, stylized animal and plant motifs, and sophisticated understanding of color and composition that indicate both individual artistic talent and cultural traditions that valued beauty and creative expression. Figurines found in Ubaid sites suggest rich mythological and religious traditions, while decorative objects made from imported materials demonstrate that these communities appreciated luxury and artistic achievement alongside practical necessities. By the end of the Ubaid period, around 4000 BCE, the foundations had been established for everything that would follow in Mesopotamian history. The basic patterns of settlement, agriculture, religion, social organization, and trade that emerged during these crucial centuries would continue to influence Mesopotamian civilizations for thousands of years, even as they evolved and became increasingly sophisticated. The communities that flourished during the Ubaid period had successfully solved humanity's most fundamental challenge: how to create stable, prosperous societies that could support large populations while maintaining the social cohesion necessary for long-term survival and growth. Perhaps most importantly, the innovations of the Ubaid period had created something entirely new in human history: the possibility of surplus. For the first time, human communities could produce more food, goods, and resources than they needed for immediate survival, and this surplus would become the foundation for all subsequent developments in art, religion, government, technology, and learning. The stage was now set for the next great transformation that would carry these early achievements toward even more remarkable heights of human accomplishment and create the world's first true cities. The surplus that had emerged from the Ubaid communities created possibilities that no human society had ever before imagined, and by 4000 BCE, those possibilities began to manifest in ways that would fundamentally transform not just Mesopotamia, but humanity's entire trajectory toward complex civilization. What followed during the next 5 centuries has been called the Uruk Revolution, a period of such rapid innovation and social transformation that it represents one of the most dramatic accelerations in human development ever recorded in the archaeological record. The most immediately visible change was demographic population numbers that had grown slowly and steadily during the Ubaid period suddenly began expanding at unprecedented rates, as improved agricultural techniques and more reliable food storage systems allowed communities to support far larger numbers of people than had ever been possible before. Villages that had housed perhaps a few hundred residents during the Ubaid period began swelling to accommodate thousands, while entirely new settlements appeared across the landscape as families and clans spread out to exploit previously uninhabited regions where the combination of river access and fertile soil promised agricultural abundance. But this population explosion was not simply a matter of existing communities growing larger. It represented a fundamental shift in how human beings organized themselves spatially and socially. Instead of the relatively dispersed settlement patterns that had characterized earlier periods, people began concentrating in increasingly dense clusters around particularly advantageous locations, places where multiple rivers converged, where natural harbors facilitated water transportation, or where elevated terrain provided protection from flooding, while still offering easy access to fertile floodplains. The city that would come to be known as Uruk exemplified this new pattern of settlement in the most dramatic way possible, growing from a modest Ubaid period community to become what many scholars consider the world's first true city, a massive urban centre that by 3500 BCE housed an estimated 40,000 people within its walls and controlled agricultural territories extending for miles in every direction. Walking through Uruk during this period would have been unlike anything any human being had ever experienced before. With narrow streets winding between closely packed houses, workshops filled with craftsmen producing goods for trade and local consumption, and markets where people from dozens of different communities gathered to exchange products, ideas, and stories. The technological innovations that emerged during the Uruk period read like a catalogue of humanity's most important inventions, each one building upon earlier discoveries to create possibilities that transformed both daily life and long-term social development. The wheel, perhaps the most famous of these innovations, began not as a transportation device, but as a potter's tool, a horizontal disc that could be spun to shape ceramic vessels with unprecedented speed and precision, allowing skilled artisans to produce both utilitarian containers and elaborate ceremonial pieces with levels of symmetry and decoration that had been impossible to achieve using earlier hand-building techniques. From pottery wheels, it was a relatively short conceptual leap to wheeled vehicles, and by 3500 BCE, Mesopotamian craftsmen were constructing sophisticated carts and wagons that could transport heavy loads across long distances far more efficiently than human porters or pack animals alone. These early vehicles were crude by later standards, solid wooden wheels attached to simple axles, but they represented a revolution in transportation that would make possible the extensive trade networks and territorial control systems that characterized all subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. Equally transformative was the development of the plough, an agricultural tool that allowed farmers to prepare soil and plant crops on a scale that would have been unimaginable, using only hand tools and human labor. The earliest ploughs were simple wooden implements that could be pulled by oxen to break up soil and create furrows for planting. But even these basic devices increased agricultural productivity so dramatically that communities could support much larger populations while requiring fewer people to be directly involved in food production creating. For the first time in human history, significant numbers of people who could dedicate their entire working lives to activities other than farming. The development of sailing technology during this period opened up entirely new possibilities for transportation and trade that would prove crucial for the expansion of Mesopotamian influence throughout the region and beyond. Early sailboats were probably simple reed vessels with basic cloth or hide sails, but they allowed merchants and travellers to move up and down the rivers far more quickly and efficiently than had been possible using only human muscle power, while also making it practical to transport heavy or bulky goods across long distances. Perhaps the most intellectually significant innovation of the Uruk period was the emergence of proto-writing systems that would eventually evolve into the world's first true written language. This development began with a system of clay tokens, small-shaped objects that represented specific quantities of particular goods, that merchants and administrators used to keep track of trade transactions and stored inventory. Archaeological excavations have uncovered thousands of these tokens from Uruk period sites, revealing a sophisticated accounting system that could track complex commercial relationships involving multiple parties, different types of goods, and transactions that extended across considerable periods of time. As trade networks became more complex, and the quantities of goods being managed grew larger, this token system evolved toward greater abstraction and efficiency. Instead of using physical tokens to represent every transaction, accountants began pressing the tokens into soft clay tablets to create permanent records, and eventually discovered that they could achieve the same results by simply drawing pictographic representations of the tokens directly onto the clay surface. These early pictographs were still quite literal, a drawing of a sheep's head to represent sheep, a drawing of a grain ear to represent barley, but they represented humanity's first steps toward the abstract symbolic thinking that would eventually make possible complex literature, legal codes, scientific treatises, and all the other forms of written communication that we now take for granted. The architectural achievements of the Uruk period reflect both the increased resources available to these growing communities and their evolving understanding of monumental construction techniques that could create buildings impressive enough to serve important religious and political functions. The first true ziggurats appeared during this period, massive stepped pyramid structures that rose high above the surrounding landscape and served as both religious centers and powerful symbols of community identity and divine favor. These early ziggurats were far simpler than the elaborate structures that would be built during later periods, but they represented unprecedented achievements in planning, engineering, and construction management that required the coordinated labor of thousands of people working under sophisticated supervision over extended periods of time. Building a ziggurat demanded not just physical labor, but also mathematical knowledge for calculating angles and proportions, engineering expertise for creating stable foundations and load-bearing walls, artistic vision for designing decorative elements, and administrative skills for organizing the complex logistics of transporting materials, feeding workers, and maintaining quality control throughout the construction process. The emergence of craft specialization during the Uruk period created, for the first time in human history, entire classes of people whose primary occupation was the production of specific types of goods or the performance of particular specialized services. Master potters developed techniques for creating increasingly sophisticated ceramic vessels, while metalworkers learned to smelt copper and bronze into tools and weapons that were far superior to anything that could be made from stone or wood. Textile workers created elaborate fabrics using new weaving techniques and decorative patterns, while stone carvers produced both utilitarian objects and artistic masterpieces that demonstrated remarkable skill and aesthetic sophistication. This specialization was made possible by the agricultural surplus that allowed communities to support people who were not directly involved in food production, but it also created entirely new forms of social organization and economic relationships. Specialized craftsmen needed access to raw materials that might come from distant regions, markets where they could sell their products, and customers who possessed the wealth necessary to purchase luxury goods. These requirements led to increasingly complex systems of trade, credit, and social stratification that would become defining characteristics of all subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations. The expansion of long-distance trade networks during the Uruk period connected Mesopotamian communities not just with their immediate neighbors, but with societies throughout the region and beyond, creating cultural and economic relationships that would influence development throughout the ancient world. Archaeological evidence reveals trade connections extending from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, from the Zagros Mountains to the Egyptian frontier, carrying not just goods, but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that would spread Mesopotamian innovations far beyond their original homeland. These trade networks required increasingly sophisticated systems of transportation, communication, and standardization that pushed Mesopotamian societies toward greater complexity and organization. Merchants needed reliable ways to transport goods across long distances, standardized weights and measures that would be accepted in different communities, methods for ensuring the quality and authenticity of traded goods, and legal frameworks that could resolve disputes and enforce contracts across cultural and political boundaries. The political evolution that occurred during the Uruk period reflected the growing complexity of these communities and their need for more sophisticated forms of governance and social coordination. The simple leadership structures that had sufficed for small agricultural villages were clearly inadequate for managing cities with tens of thousands of residents, complex craft production systems, extensive trade relationships, and monumental construction projects that required the coordinated labor of large numbers of people over extended periods. Archaeological evidence suggests that during this period, power began concentrating in the hands of individuals and institutions that could effectively coordinate these complex activities, probably religious leaders who controlled the temple complexes that served as centers for both spiritual and economic life, but possibly also military leaders who could organize defense against external threats and maintain internal order. The emergence of elaborate burial practices and luxury goods associated with particular individuals indicates that social hierarchies were becoming both more pronounced and more formalized than they had been during earlier periods. By 3500 BCE, the innovations and transformations of the Uruk period had created communities that were recognizably urban in character, places where large numbers of people lived in close proximity, engaged in specialized occupations, participated in complex economic relationships, and organized themselves under sophisticated political and religious institutions. These early cities represented something entirely new in human experience, and their success would inspire imitators throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. The stage was now set for the next great leap forward in human civilization: the development of true writing systems that would allow these complex societies to preserve their knowledge, laws, literature, and historical memories for future generations. creating the foundation for all the intellectual and cultural achievements that would follow in the centuries and millennia ahead. The writing systems that would soon emerge were not created in isolation, but rather developed as essential tools for managing the extraordinary urban experiment that was transforming the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia during these pivotal centuries. By 3500 BCE, the settlement of Uruk had grown beyond anything that could reasonably be called a large village, and had become something entirely unprecedented in human experience. A true metropolis that housed not thousands, but tens of thousands of people within its expanding boundaries, creating challenges and opportunities that no society in human history had ever before attempted to address. Standing at the edge of Uruk during this remarkable period, a traveller would have been confronted by a vista that defied everything previous generations had understood about how human beings could live together in organised communities. The city stretched across the landscape for miles in every direction, its mud brick buildings rising like a geometric mountain range above the flat floodplain, while columns of smoke from countless workshops, kitchens and kilns created a perpetual haze that could be seen from tremendous distances. The constant sounds of urban life, the hammering of metal workers, the chanting of priests conducting ceremonies, the calls of merchants advertising their wares, the laughter of children playing in narrow alleyways created an acoustic tapestry unlike anything that had ever existed before in the natural world. What made Uruk's growth even more remarkable was not simply its size, but the sophisticated planning and organization that allowed such a massive concentration of people to function effectively as a coherent community. The city was not a random accumulation of buildings and people, but rather a carefully designed urban environment divided into distinct districts, each serving specific functions within the broader metropolitan system. Residential neighborhoods housed families according to both occupation and social status, with the homes of wealthy merchants and skilled craftsmen clustered in areas that provided easy access to the city's commercial and religious centers, while agricultural workers and general laborers lived in more modest quarters near the city's periphery. The most impressive of these districts was undoubtedly the Sacred Precinct, a vast complex of temples, ceremonial courtyards, and administrative buildings that served as both the spiritual heart of the community and the center of its increasingly sophisticated economic and political activities. This area was dominated by the White Temple, an architectural achievement so remarkable that it would influence religious construction throughout Mesopotamia for thousands of years to come. Rising nearly 40 feet above the surrounding landscape on an artificial platform built from millions of carefully arranged mud bricks, the White Temple gleamed like a beacon across the countryside, its lime plaster walls reflecting sunlight during the day and torchlight during the night in ways that must have seemed almost supernatural to observers approaching the city from distant regions. The construction of the White Temple represented not just an architectural achievement, but a triumph of organizational capability that demonstrated how far these early urban societies had progressed in their ability to coordinate complex collective activities. Building such a structure required the labor of thousands of workers over several years, along with sophisticated systems for obtaining and transporting raw materials, feeding and housing the construction crews, maintaining quality control throughout the building process, and managing the enormous logistical challenges involved in moving millions of individual bricks into precisely the right positions to create stable walls and foundations. But the White Temple was more than just an impressive building. It was the physical manifestation of revolutionary new ideas about the relationship between human communities and the divine forces that governed the natural world. Unlike the simple shrines and ceremonial spaces that had served earlier communities, this massive structure was designed as an elaborate dwelling place for the city's patron deity, complete with private chambers, reception halls, storage facilities, and ceremonial spaces that could accommodate large public gatherings and complex religious rituals. The economic implications of this religious innovation were profound and far-reaching. The White Temple and its associated buildings functioned as the center of a vast economic enterprise that controlled agricultural lands extending for miles beyond the city walls, managed the labor of thousands of workers, stored enormous quantities of grain and other commodities, and coordinated trade relationships with communities throughout the region and beyond. This temple estate system represented humanity's first experiment with large-scale institutional management, creating organizational structures and administrative techniques that would be copied and refined by every subsequent Mesopotamian civilization. The population surge that made Uruk possible was not simply a matter of natural increase among existing residents, but reflected a fundamental transformation in how people throughout the region chose to organize their lives and communities. Villages that had been largely self-sufficient during earlier periods began sending their surplus agricultural products to Uruk in exchange for manufactured goods, specialized services, and access to the extensive trade networks that the city controlled. Young people from rural areas migrated to the city seeking opportunities for education, apprenticeships with skilled craftsmen, or employment in the growing service sectors that catered to the city's increasingly diverse population. This transformation from village to urban life required individuals and families to develop entirely new ways of thinking about work, social relationships, and daily routines. Instead of the seasonal rhythms that had governed agricultural communities, city dwellers operated according to the demands of specialized occupations that required consistent daily labor throughout the year. Instead of the face-to-face relationships that characterized small villages where everyone knew everyone else, urban residents had to learn to navigate complex social environments where they interacted with strangers on a regular basis, and where social status and occupational identity became more important than kinship connections in determining an individual's place within the community. The economic transformation that accompanied urbanization created entirely new forms of wealth and social organization that would become defining characteristics of all subsequent civilizations. The temple estate system that centered on the White Temple controlled not just religious activities, but also vast agricultural holdings, manufacturing operations, and trade relationships that generated surplus wealth on an unprecedented scale. This wealth was not distributed equally among the city's residents, but rather concentrated in the hands of the religious and political authorities who controlled the temple system, creating the most pronounced social hierarchies that human societies had yet developed. At the apex of this emerging social pyramid stood the high priests and priestesses who managed the temple estates and served as intermediaries between the city's human population and its patron deities. These religious leaders controlled enormous resources and wielded authority that extended far beyond purely spiritual matters to encompass economic planning, legal disputes, diplomatic relationships, and military activities. Their residences were elaborate compounds that reflected both their wealth and their status, filled with luxury goods imported from distant regions and decorated with artistic masterpieces created by the city's most skilled craftsmen. Below the high religious authorities, but still occupying positions of considerable privilege and influence, were the specialized administrators, scribes, and technical experts who managed the day-to-day operations of the temple estates and the city's various economic enterprises. These individuals represented humanity's first professional administrative class people, whose expertise lay not in producing physical goods or providing manual labor, but in organizing, recording, and coordinating the complex activities that made urban life possible. The skilled craftsmen who produced the manufactured goods that made Uruk famous throughout the region occupied an intermediate position within the city's social hierarchy, enjoying considerably more wealth and status than simple laborers, while remaining clearly subordinate to the religious and administrative elites. Master potters, metal workers, textile producers, and stone carvers established workshops that employed apprentices and assistants in sophisticated production systems that could create both utilitarian objects for local use and luxury goods for trade with distant communities. At the base of the urban social pyramid were the agricultural workers, general labourers, and service providers who performed the essential but less prestigious work that kept the city functioning on a daily basis. These individuals enjoyed certain advantages that came with urban residents' access to a wider variety of foods and manufactured goods, opportunities for their children to receive education and training, participation in the rich ceremonial and cultural life of the city, but they possessed little wealth or political influence and remained dependent on the goodwill of their social superiors for their basic security and survival. The administrative innovations that made it possible to manage such a complex and diverse urban population represented some of humanity's most important organizational achievements. The simple leadership structures that had sufficed for small agricultural villages were clearly inadequate for coordinating the activities of tens of thousands of people engaged in dozens of different occupations and participating in economic relationships that extended across vast geographic regions. The solution that emerged in Uruk involved the creation of sophisticated bureaucratic systems centered on the temple complexes, but extending throughout the city's various districts and economic sectors. Teams of trained administrators developed standardized procedures for collecting taxes, managing public works projects, resolving legal disputes, maintaining public order, and coordinating the complex logistical activities required to keep food and other essential supplies flowing into the city from the surrounding countryside. These administrative systems required not just organizational innovation, but also new technologies for recording and preserving information about the increasingly complex transactions and relationships that characterized urban life. The token-based accounting systems that had emerged during the previous period were expanded and refined to handle much larger volumes of data, while the early experiments with pictographic notation began evolving toward more sophisticated symbolic representations that could capture not just simple inventory information, but also complex legal agreements, religious texts, and historical records. The success of Uruk's urban experiment inspired imitators throughout Mesopotamia and beyond, as communities throughout the region attempted to replicate the economic prosperity and cultural achievements that urbanization had made possible. Other cities began emerging along the major rivers, each developing its own variations on the basic urban model that Uruk had pioneered, but all sharing the fundamental characteristics that defined this new form of human organization: concentrated populations, specialized occupations, social hierarchies, religious institutions, and administrative systems that could coordinate complex collective activities. By 3000 BCE, the urban revolution had fundamentally transformed the landscape of Mesopotamia and created the foundation for all subsequent developments in art, religion, government, technology, and learning that would characterize the world's first literate civilizations. The challenges of managing these early cities had pushed human societies toward innovations in organization, technology, and abstract thinking that would prove essential for the next great leap forward: the development of comprehensive writing systems that would allow these complex urban cultures to preserve their knowledge, laws, stories, and wisdom for future generations to build upon and expand. The comprehensive writing systems that these complex urban cultures desperately needed emerged not through sudden inspiration, but through a remarkable evolutionary process that transformed humanity's relationship with knowledge, memory, and abstract thought in ways that continue to influence every aspect of our intellectual lives today. Around 3200 BCE, in the bustling administrative centers of Uruk and other growing Mesopotamian cities, the practical demands of managing increasingly sophisticated economic and social systems pushed creative minds toward innovations that would prove to be among the most consequential achievements in human history. The journey from simple record-keeping to true literacy began with those clay tokens that had served Mesopotamian merchants and administrators for centuries. Small, carefully shaped objects that represented specific quantities of particular goods in trade transactions and inventory management systems. These tokens had proven remarkably effective for their intended purposes, allowing complex commercial relationships to be tracked and verified across time and distance. But as the urban economies of places like Uruk grew more sophisticated, the sheer volume of transactions and the complexity of the relationships being managed began to overwhelm the practical limitations of physical token systems. Picture the administrative chambers of the White Temple during this period. Vast rooms filled with countless clay tokens organized in baskets, boxes, and containers according to elaborate systems that only trained specialists could navigate effectively. Temple administrators responsible for managing the agricultural estates, craft workshops, and trade relationships that supported thousands of urban residents found themselves spending enormous amounts of time simply locating the specific tokens needed to record individual transactions, while the storage requirements for maintaining comprehensive records threatened to consume more and more of the valuable space needed for other essential activities. The solution that emerged represented one of those elegant simplifications that occasionally transform entire fields of human activity. Instead of storing physical tokens to represent every transaction, administrators began pressing the tokens into soft clay tablets to create permanent impressions, then storing the tablets instead of the tokens themselves. This innovation immediately reduced the storage space required for record keeping while creating more durable records that could be easily organized, transported, and referenced without the constant handling that gradually wore down physical tokens over repeated use. But this practical innovation contained within it the seeds of a much more profound transformation. As administrators became accustomed to working with token impressions pressed into clay tablets, some creative individuals began to realize that they could achieve the same results more efficiently by simply drawing representations of the token shapes directly onto the clay surface using a reed stylus. These early pictographs were still quite literal and closely tied to the physical objects they represented: a sheep's head to indicate sheep, a grain ear to represent barley, a jug symbol to denote liquid measures. But they represented humanity's first steps away from direct physical representation toward the abstract symbolic thinking that would eventually make possible all forms of written communication. The development of what we now call cuneiform writing, named for the wedge-shaped marks created by pressing reed styluses into clay, occurred gradually over several centuries as scribes experimented with ways to make their symbolic representations more efficient, standardized, and capable of expressing increasingly complex ideas. The earliest pictographs were relatively realistic drawings that clearly resembled the objects they represented. But as the writing system developed, these images became increasingly abstract and stylized, eventually evolving into combinations of wedge-shaped marks that bore no obvious resemblance to their original pictographic origins. This evolution from realistic pictures to abstract symbols represented more than just a practical improvement in writing efficiency. It reflected a fundamental transformation in human cognitive capabilities that would have profound implications for every subsequent development in art, science, philosophy, and literature. Abstract symbolic thinking required writers and readers to develop new mental skills for creating and interpreting representations that were not directly tied to physical reality, opening up possibilities for expressing complex ideas about concepts that had no concrete physical existence. Justice, love, destiny, divinity, mathematical relationships, philosophical principles, and all the other abstractions that would become central concerns of literate civilizations. The administrative necessity that drove these early writing innovations created increasingly sophisticated systems for recording and managing the complex economic relationships that characterized urban life in places like Uruk. Temple administrators developed standardized procedures for tracking agricultural production across multiple estates, recording the quantities and qualities of goods stored in vast temple granaries, managing the complex craft production systems that created luxury goods for local use and international trade, and maintaining detailed records of the commercial relationships that connected Mesopotamian cities with trading partners throughout the region and beyond. These early administrative documents reveal remarkably sophisticated understanding of economic principles that would not be formally articulated by economic theorists for thousands of years. Temple records show evidence of complex contracts involving multiple parties, interest-bearing loans, insurance arrangements, and other financial instruments that demonstrate how quickly these early urban societies developed the institutional frameworks necessary for managing large-scale economic activities across extended periods of time. But the most remarkable development during this period was the gradual expansion of writing beyond purely administrative functions toward the preservation and transmission of cultural knowledge that had previously existed only in oral traditions passed down through generations of storytellers, priests, and community elders. The earliest examples of what we might recognize as literature began appearing on clay tablets around 2900 BCE myths about the creation of the world and the relationships between gods and humans, hymns praising the deities who protected particular cities and communities, and inscriptions celebrating the achievements of rulers and the prosperity of their subjects. These early literary works reveal sophisticated understanding of narrative structure, poetic imagery, and symbolic representation that indicate the existence of rich oral traditions that had been developing for centuries before anyone thought to preserve them in written form. The myth cycles that emerged during this period established themes and characters that would continue to influence Mesopotamian literature for thousands of years, while also providing insights into how these early urban societies understood their place in the cosmos and their relationships with the divine forces that governed natural phenomena like flooding, drought, fertility, and harvest success. The creation of formal educational institutions to train the scribes necessary for maintaining these increasingly complex writing systems represented another revolutionary innovation that would have lasting influence on how human societies preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. The first scribal schools appeared in Uruk and other major cities around 2900 BCE, establishing educational practices and curriculum designs that would be copied throughout the ancient world and continue to influence educational philosophy even today. These early schools were typically associated with major temples or palaces, reflecting the close connection between literacy and administrative power that characterized early Mesopotamian civilizations. Students, who were primarily young men from wealthy families, underwent years of rigorous training that included not just learning to read and write cuneiform symbols, but also mastering mathematics, astronomy, law, literature, and the complex religious and cultural traditions that educated individuals were expected to understand and preserve. The curriculum in these scribal schools reveals remarkable sophistication in pedagogical methods that combined rote memorization of fundamental skills with creative exercises designed to develop higher-order thinking abilities. Students began by practicing individual cuneiform signs until they could write them quickly and accurately, then progressed to copying standard administrative documents, legal contracts, and literary texts. Advanced students were eventually expected to compose original works demonstrating their mastery of literary techniques, legal principles, and the cultural knowledge that marked them as educated members of society. The knowledge preservation revolution that resulted from these educational innovations transformed how human societies could accumulate, organize, and transmit information across generations. For the first time in human history, knowledge was not limited to what individual people could remember and pass on through oral traditions, but could be preserved in permanent written records that could be copied, distributed, and referenced by future generations of scholars and administrators. This transformation had profound implications for the pace of human intellectual development. Instead of each generation having to rediscover essential knowledge through direct experience, written records allowed new generations to build upon the accumulated achievements of their predecessors, accelerating the development of increasingly sophisticated understandings in every field of human inquiry from medicine and mathematics to law and literature. The intellectual impact of literacy extended far beyond its practical applications in administration and education to influence the fundamental ways that human beings understood themselves and their world. Written language required and developed new forms of abstract thinking that had not been necessary in purely oral cultures, pushing human cognitive capabilities toward greater precision, logical analysis, and systematic organization of complex ideas. The process of writing forced people to think more carefully about the exact meanings of words, the logical relationships between different ideas, and the most effective ways to organize complex information so that it could be understood by readers who were not present during the original composition. These intellectual demands stimulated developments in logical reasoning, systematic classification, and analytical thinking that would eventually contribute to the emergence of formal philosophy, scientific methodology, and all the other systematic approaches to understanding reality that characterize literate civilizations. Perhaps most importantly, literacy created the possibility for individuals to engage in extended intellectual dialogue with people they had never met and who might have lived in different times and places. Written texts allowed readers to encounter ideas, experiences, and perspectives that extended far beyond their immediate personal experience, fostering intellectual curiosity, cultural understanding, and the kind of expanded awareness that becomes possible when human consciousness is not limited to direct personal experience and local oral traditions. By 2900 BCE, the writing revolution had created intellectual and cultural capabilities that would prove essential for every subsequent development in Mesopotamian civilization. The administrative systems that had emerged to manage complex urban economies provided the organizational frameworks that would be adapted for governmental, legal, and military purposes. The educational institutions that trained literate administrators and scholars created the intellectual infrastructure necessary for the development of specialized knowledge in every field of human endeavor. Most importantly, the preservation of cultural knowledge in written form created the foundation for the rich literary, religious, and intellectual traditions that would define Mesopotamian civilization and influence every subsequent culture that encountered their remarkable achievements. The rich literary, religious, and intellectual traditions that written language made possible found their most profound and lasting expression in the development of comprehensive theological systems that would influence human understanding of divinity, cosmos, and moral order for thousands of years to come. As scribes throughout Mesopotamia began using their newly acquired literacy skills to preserve the oral traditions that had been passed down through countless generations, they created written records of mythological narratives, religious philosophies, and cosmological concepts that reveal remarkably sophisticated attempts to understand humanity's place within a universe governed by powerful divine forces whose actions determined everything from individual personal fortunes to the rise and fall of entire civilizations. The pantheon of deities that emerged in written form during this period reflected thousands of years of religious thinking and spiritual experience, but also demonstrated how the challenges of urban life had pushed Mesopotamian societies toward increasingly complex understanding of divine hierarchy, cosmic order, and the intricate relationships between gods and mortals that governed all aspects of existence. At the apex of this divine hierarchy stood An, the sky god whose authority encompassed the highest heavens, and whose power was so vast and remote that direct interaction with human beings was virtually unimaginable, making him a figure of ultimate cosmic authority who remained largely beyond the reach of ordinary religious practice and personal devotion. Below An, but wielding enormous practical influence over human affairs, was Enlil, the god of air, wind, and storm, whose authority extended over the earthly atmosphere that all living creatures depended upon for survival. Enlil's character embodied both the life-giving and destructive aspects of natural forces that agricultural societies knew all too well. The gentle rains that nourished crops and the devastating storms that could destroy entire harvests. The favourable winds that filled sails and powered mills alongside the violent tempests that could level buildings and drown livestock in sudden floods. His worship reflected the complex relationship that farming communities necessarily developed with weather patterns and atmospheric conditions that could bring either prosperity or disaster with equal unpredictability. Equally important, but representing entirely different aspects of divine power, was Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and craftsmanship, whose domain included the rivers, springs, and underground water sources that made agriculture and urban life possible in the Mesopotamian environment, Enki was portrayed as humanity's divine patron and protector, the deity most likely to intervene on behalf of human beings when they faced threats from other gods, natural disasters, or human enemies. His association with wisdom and technical knowledge made him particularly important to the scribes, craftsmen, and administrators whose specialized skills were essential for maintaining complex urban societies. The goddess Inanna represented perhaps the most complex and fascinating aspects of Sumerian religious thinking, embodying the powerful forces of love, fertility, warfare, and political authority that could transform individual lives and entire societies with equal dramatic force. Her mythology reveals sophisticated understanding of the dual nature of divine power. She was simultaneously the goddess who blessed marriages and ensured agricultural fertility, and the fierce warrior deity who could destroy enemies and overthrow established political orders when circumstances demanded such radical interventions. These primary deities were surrounded by dozens of lesser gods and goddesses who controlled specific aspects of natural phenomena, human activities, and geographical locations, creating a comprehensive theological system that could address virtually every concern that might arise in the daily lives of urban dwellers. Each major city had its own patron deity who was believed to reside in the city's primary temple and take special interest in the welfare of its human residents, while also participating in the broader divine community that governed cosmic affairs on a universal scale. The Sumerian understanding of cosmic structure reflected both careful observation of natural phenomena and sophisticated symbolic thinking about the relationships between different realms of existence that human beings could observe or imagine. The physical universe was conceived as consisting of three primary layers: the heavens above, where the gods resided and cosmic decisions were made; the earth in the middle, where human beings lived their daily lives under divine oversight; and the underworld below, where the souls of the deceased continued their existence under conditions that reflected both their moral behavior during life and their social status within human communities. This three-tiered cosmic model was not simply an abstract theological concept, but rather a practical framework that influenced everything from architectural design to agricultural planning to legal principles. Temple complexes were designed as physical representations of this cosmic structure, with their elevated platforms representing the divine realm, their ground-level courtyards symbolizing the human world, and their foundation levels connecting symbolically with the underworld domain of the deceased and the chthonic deities who controlled fertility and regeneration. The temple complexes that served as the earthly dwelling places of these deities represented some of the most ambitious architectural and artistic achievements of early Mesopotamian civilization, combining practical functions as economic and administrative centers with symbolic purposes as representations of divine presence within human communities. These elaborate structures were conceived not merely as places where people could come to worship or make offerings, but as actual residences where the gods lived among their human subjects and participated actively in the daily life of their cities. The largest and most impressive temples were designed according to sophisticated architectural principles that reflected theological concepts about divine hierarchy, cosmic order, and the proper relationships between gods and mortals. The main sanctuary, where the deity's statue resided and received daily care from priests and priestesses, was typically located in the most elevated and protected part of the complex, surrounded by smaller chambers that served as divine bedrooms, dining halls, reception areas, and storage facilities for the deity's personal possessions and ceremonial regalia. Surrounding these central divine residences were extensive complexes of workshops, granaries, administrative offices, and residential quarters for the hundreds of priests, priestesses, scribes, craftsmen, and servants who maintained the temple operations and managed the vast economic enterprises that supported both divine worship and urban prosperity. These temple estates controlled thousands of acres of agricultural land, employed hundreds of skilled workers, maintained extensive trade relationships with communities throughout the region, and served as centers for banking, legal disputes, and diplomatic negotiations that extended far beyond purely religious activities. The ritual life that unfolded within these temple complexes created a continuous cycle of ceremonial activities that connected human communities with divine power through daily offerings, seasonal festivals, and life cycle celebrations that marked important transitions in both individual lives and collective community experiences. Every morning, temple personnel performed elaborate ceremonies that included awakening the deity's statue, providing ritual meals, offering prayers and hymns, and conducting the various maintenance activities necessary to keep the divine residence properly maintained and functioning. These daily rituals were supplemented by seasonal festivals that celebrated important agricultural cycles, astronomical events, and mythological narratives that connected contemporary community life with the cosmic dramas that the gods enacted on behalf of their human subjects. The New Year festival, which typically coincided with the spring floods that renewed agricultural fertility, involved elaborate processions, dramatic reenactments of creation myths, and ceremonial renewal of political and social relationships that reinforced community solidarity and divine favor. The sacred calendar that organized these ritual activities reflected sophisticated understanding of both agricultural cycles and astronomical phenomena that revealed how closely Sumerian religious thinking was connected to practical observation of natural patterns and their implications for human survival and prosperity. Priests and scribes developed increasingly accurate methods for tracking lunar months, solar years, and the movements of visible planets and stars, creating calendar systems that could predict seasonal changes, optimize agricultural activities, and coordinate complex ceremonial schedules across multiple communities and regions. This astronomical knowledge was not pursued for purely practical purposes, but was understood as essential religious learning that revealed divine intentions and cosmic patterns that human beings needed to understand and respect in order to maintain harmonious relationships with the forces that controlled their destiny. The movements of celestial bodies were interpreted as divine communications that could provide guidance for political decisions, agricultural planning, military campaigns, and other activities where human success depended upon choosing the right timing and appropriate methods for achieving desired outcomes. The mythology that flourished during this period preserved and developed these religious and cosmological concepts through narrative traditions that combined entertainment with education, providing communities with shared stories that explain the origins of the world, the nature of divine power, the proper relationships between gods and mortals, and the moral principles that should guide human behavior in both individual and collective contexts. The creation epics that emerged during this period established themes and patterns that would influence religious thinking throughout the ancient world and continue to resonate in contemporary religious and philosophical traditions. These narratives typically describe the emergence of ordered cosmos from primordial chaos through the actions of powerful deities who shaped the physical universe, established the natural laws that governed physical phenomena, and created human beings to serve as intermediaries between the divine and material realms. The heroic tales that developed alongside these creation myths explored the complex relationships between divine will and human agency, celebrating individuals who achieved great accomplishments through combinations of personal courage, divine favor, and moral righteousness, while also warning about the dangers of hubris, disobedience, and failure to maintain proper respect for divine authority. These stories provided both entertainment and moral instruction, creating shared cultural values and behavioral expectations that helped maintain social cohesion within increasingly diverse urban communities. The religious philosophy that underlay all these mythological and ritual developments reflected sophisticated thinking about fundamental questions that continue to challenge human understanding: the nature of divine power and its relationship to natural phenomena, the purpose of human existence, and the proper goals of individual and collective life, the origins of moral obligations and the foundations of just social arrangements, and the ultimate destiny of human souls after death. Sumerian religious thinking recognized that human beings occupied a unique and somewhat precarious position within the cosmic order created by the gods to serve divine purposes, but also possessing enough intelligence and free will to make choices that could either support or disrupt the harmonious relationships that maintained universal stability and prosperity. This understanding created both opportunities and responsibilities that required careful attention to religious duties, moral behavior, and social cooperation that demonstrated proper respect for divine authority while also fulfilling human potential for wisdom, creativity, and moral development. By 2700 BCE, these religious and philosophical developments had created comprehensive worldviews that provided Mesopotamian communities with sophisticated frameworks for understanding their place within the cosmos and their relationships with the divine forces that governed both natural phenomena and human destiny, establishing intellectual and spiritual foundations that would support increasingly complex developments in law, literature, art, and social organization throughout the centuries that lay ahead. The intellectual and spiritual foundations that had emerged from Sumerian religious thinking would soon face their greatest test, as the practical challenges of governing increasingly complex urban societies pushed these early civilizations toward new forms of political organization that combined divine authority with earthly power in ways that would influence governmental structures throughout human history. By 2900 BCE, the success of the urban experiment had created conditions that made conflict almost inevitable. Multiple prosperous cities controlling overlapping territories, competing for access to the same water resources, and seeking to dominate the trade routes that connected Mesopotamia with the broader ancient world. The city-states that emerged during this period represented humanity's first experiments with independent political entities that combined urban centers with surrounding agricultural territories under unified governmental control, creating new forms of collective identity that transcended the kinship and tribal relationships that had organized human societies throughout previous millennia. Each of these emerging political units developed its own variations on the basic urban model that Uruk had pioneered, but all shared certain fundamental characteristics that would define city-state organization throughout ancient Mesopotamia and influence political development throughout the region for thousands of years to come. Situated strategically near the Persian Gulf where the combined waters of the Tigris and Euphrates reached the sea, grew into a major commercial center that controlled maritime trade connecting Mesopotamia with the distant civilizations of the Indus Valley, the Iranian Plateau, and the Arabian Peninsula. The city's location allowed its merchants to serve as intermediaries between the agricultural and manufactured products of Mesopotamia and the exotic goods, precious stones, metals, spices, and luxury crafts that wealthy urban dwellers throughout the region increasingly demanded as symbols of their prosperity and sophisticated tastes. Uruk, the pioneering metropolis whose innovations had inspired urban development throughout Mesopotamia, maintained its position as one of the region's most important religious and cultural centers, with its massive temple complexes continuing to attract pilgrims, scholars, and traders from throughout the known world. The city's religious prestige, combined with its accumulated wealth and the expertise of its craftsmen, scribes, and administrators, made it a natural center for diplomatic negotiations, legal arbitrations, and the cultural exchanges that helped maintain connections between the increasingly diverse communities that were developing throughout the region. Lagash, located in the fertile agricultural region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, became renowned for the productivity of its agricultural estates and the sophistication of its irrigation systems, which allowed the city to support large populations while generating sufficient surplus to maintain extensive craft workshops and trading operations. The engineering expertise that Lagash developed in managing water resources would prove crucial not only for the city's own prosperity, but also for the broader regional conflicts that increasingly centered on control of river water and irrigation rights. Kish, positioned at a strategic location where major overland trade routes intersected with river transportation networks, emerged as an important center for commercial activities that connected Mesopotamian cities with communities throughout the region and beyond. The city's merchants developed extensive networks of trading relationships that brought both prosperity and cultural influence, while its strategic location made it a natural center for diplomatic activities and military planning that would become increasingly important as competition between city-states intensified. Nippur occupied a unique position within the emerging system of city-states as the primary religious center for the worship of Enlil, the god of air and storms whose authority was recognized throughout Mesopotamia. This religious significance gave Nippur special status as a neutral ground where representatives from different cities could meet for religious ceremonies, diplomatic negotiations, and legal proceedings, while the city's religious revenues allowed it to maintain independence despite lacking the extensive agricultural territories or commercial advantages that supported the other major urban centers. The emergence of these independent city-states created entirely new challenges for political leadership that pushed Mesopotamian societies beyond the relatively simple governmental structures that had sufficed during earlier periods of urban development. The priest-kings, who had managed temple estates and coordinated religious activities, were increasingly confronted with problems that required different types of expertise and authority military defense against external threats, territorial disputes with neighboring cities, complex diplomatic relationships, and internal conflicts between different social groups whose interests did not always align with traditional religious and economic arrangements. This political evolution led to gradual but fundamental changes in the nature of royal authority that would influence governmental structures throughout the ancient world and establish precedents that continue to shape political thinking even today. The earliest rulers had derived their authority primarily from their roles as intermediaries between their communities and the deities who protected and prospered those communities. But the practical demands of governing complex urban societies required leaders who could also function as military commanders, diplomatic negotiators, economic managers, and judicial authorities capable of resolving disputes and maintaining order among increasingly diverse populations. The transformation of royal ideology during this period reflects sophisticated thinking about the relationships between divine authority and earthly power that would become fundamental to political philosophy throughout the ancient world. Mesopotamian rulers developed the concept of divine mandate, the idea that earthly kings received their authority directly from the gods and ruled as divine representatives whose decisions carried cosmic authority that extended far beyond merely human political arrangements. This ideology provided powerful legitimization for royal power, while also creating expectations that kings would govern according to divine principles of justice, prosperity, and protection for their subjects. Archaeological evidence from royal tombs and palace complexes reveals how thoroughly this divine mandate ideology influenced every aspect of royal life and governmental activity. Kings were portrayed in artistic works as receiving symbols of authority directly from major deities, while royal inscriptions emphasized the divine approval and support that justified their political power and military activities. Royal regalia included symbols that connected earthly rulers with cosmic authority, while palace architecture incorporated religious motifs and ceremonial spaces that reinforced the connection between royal power and divine sanction. But divine ideology alone was not sufficient to maintain political authority in an increasingly competitive environment where multiple cities claimed divine favor and where practical challenges required effective military, economic, and diplomatic solutions. The successful rulers of this period were those who could combine religious legitimacy with demonstrated competence in the practical arts of governance, military leadership, and economic management that determined whether their cities would prosper or decline in competition with their neighbors. The sophistication of warfare that developed during this period reflects both the intensity of competition between city-states and the remarkable technological and organizational innovations that Mesopotamian societies achieved in response to military challenges. Early armies were probably composed primarily of part-time citizen soldiers who were called upon to defend their cities during emergencies, while continuing their normal occupations as farmers, craftsmen, and traders during peacetime. But the increasing frequency and complexity of military conflicts gradually led to the development of more professional military organizations that could maintain readiness for extended campaigns and complex tactical operations. The weapons that archaeologists have recovered from this period demonstrate remarkable sophistication in metallurgy, engineering, and tactical thinking that pushed military technology far beyond anything that had existed in earlier periods. Bronze weapons, spears, axes, maces, and eventually swords provided significant advantages over the stone and wooden implements that had characterized earlier warfare, while developments in armor, shields, and protective equipment allowed warriors to survive combat encounters that would have been lethal using earlier military technology. Perhaps even more significant than individual weapons were the organizational innovations that allowed armies to function as coordinated units capable of complex tactical maneuvers and sustained military campaigns. Archaeological evidence suggests that Mesopotamian armies developed sophisticated command structures, standardized equipment and training procedures, and logistical systems that could supply large numbers of soldiers during extended military operations that might last for months and cover hundreds of miles of territory. The fortification systems that emerged during this period reveal equally impressive advances in military engineering and architectural planning that transformed the physical appearance of Mesopotamian cities, while providing practical defense against increasingly sophisticated military threats. City walls became massive structures that incorporated advanced understanding of geometry, materials science, and tactical defense, with elaborate gate systems, towers, and internal defensive positions that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones while protecting defenders and civilian populations. The territorial struggles that dominated this period were not simply matters of military ambition or royal pride, but reflected genuine conflicts over resources that were essential for urban survival and prosperity. Water rights became particularly contentious issues as growing populations and expanding agricultural systems increased demand for irrigation water beyond what the natural river systems could supply during dry seasons or drought years. Cities that controlled upstream positions along major rivers could potentially starve downstream competitors by diverting water for their own use, creating conflicts that often escalated into military confrontations with far-reaching political and economic consequences. Control of trade routes represented another major source of conflict, as the prosperity of Mesopotamian cities increasingly depended upon their ability to maintain commercial relationships with distant suppliers and customers. Cities that could control strategic positions along major trade routes, river crossings, mountain passes, desert oases, could collect customs revenues, regulate the flow of goods, and potentially disrupt the commercial activities of their competitors, creating powerful economic weapons that could be as effective as military force in determining the balance of power between different political entities. The archaeological treasures that have been recovered from the Royal Cemetery of Ur provide unprecedented insights into the wealth, artistic achievements, and cultural sophistication that characterized the most successful city-states during this period, while also revealing the extent to which royal power had become associated with luxury, ceremony, and conspicuous display that distinguished rulers from their subjects in ways that had not been necessary during earlier periods of political development. The grave goods found in these royal tombs include masterpieces of craftsmanship that demonstrate technical expertise and artistic vision that rival the greatest achievements of any civilization in human history. Elaborate jewelry incorporating gold, silver, and precious stones from throughout the known world, musical instruments decorated with mythological scenes and inlaid with exotic materials, weapons and ceremonial objects that combine practical functionality with aesthetic beauty that reveal sophisticated understanding of both technical requirements and artistic principles. Perhaps even more significant than individual objects are the burial practices revealed by these archaeological discoveries, which indicate that royal courts had developed elaborate ceremonial traditions and hierarchical social arrangements that reflected the increasing complexity of political and social organization during this period. Some royal burials included dozens of attendants who were apparently killed to accompany their rulers into the afterlife, suggesting court systems that involved hundreds of specialized personnel guards, servants, musicians, craftsmen, administrators, whose entire lives were organized around supporting and serving royal authority. The political complexity that emerged from these developments created increasingly sophisticated systems of alliances, conflicts, and diplomatic relationships that connected city-states throughout Mesopotamia in networks of cooperation and competition that would influence regional politics for centuries to come. Cities that might be military enemies in disputes over territory or water rights could simultaneously maintain commercial partnerships that benefited both communities, while religious obligations and cultural connections created relationships that transcended immediate political conflicts and provided frameworks for negotiation and peaceful resolution of disputes. The diplomatic innovations that developed during this period included formal treaty arrangements, marriage alliances between royal families, commercial agreements that regulated trade relationships, and military pacts that provided mutual defense against external threats, while potentially creating obligations for intervention in conflicts between alliance partners. These international relationships required new forms of administrative expertise and cultural understanding that pushed Mesopotamian societies toward greater sophistication in legal thinking, cultural awareness, and strategic planning that would prove essential for the even more complex political developments that would follow in subsequent centuries. By 2600 BCE, the competitive city-state system had created political, military, and diplomatic innovations that established many of the fundamental patterns of governmental organization, international relations, and social hierarchy that would characterize Mesopotamian civilization throughout its subsequent development, while also setting the stage for the next great transformation that would attempt to resolve the conflicts and limitations of the city-state system through the creation of larger political units that could achieve stability and prosperity on a regional rather than merely local scale. The regional rather than merely local scale of political organization that had emerged by 2600 BCE created conditions of competitive prosperity that would paradoxically produce one of humanity's most remarkable periods of cultural achievement, as the very rivalries and conflicts that had seemed to threaten Mesopotamian stability instead fostered an extraordinary flowering of artistic creativity, intellectual innovation, and social sophistication that established many of the fundamental patterns of civilized life that continue to influence human culture today. The competitive pressures that drove city-states to outdo one another in military prowess and political influence also pushed them toward increasingly impressive achievements in art, literature, science, and engineering that served both practical purposes and symbolic functions as demonstrations of divine favor, royal competence, and cultural superiority. The artistic mastery that emerged during this golden age represents a quantum leap in both technical sophistication and aesthetic vision that transformed Mesopotamian visual culture from the relatively simple, decorative traditions of earlier periods into complex artistic languages capable of expressing sophisticated ideas about beauty, power, religious devotion, and social relationships. Sculptors working in stone, metal, and ceramic materials developed techniques that allowed them to create works of remarkable realism and emotional depth, while also establishing stylistic conventions that would influence artistic traditions throughout the ancient world for thousands of years to come. The life-size statue of Gudea of Lagash, carved from imported diorite with such precision that individual fabric textures and facial features appear almost photographic in their detail, exemplifies the technical mastery that Mesopotamian sculptors achieved during this period, while also demonstrating how artistic excellence served political and religious purposes by creating permanent monuments to royal power and divine favor that could communicate complex messages about authority, piety, and cultural achievement to both contemporary audiences and future generations. These monumental sculptures required not only individual artistic genius, but also sophisticated workshop organizations that could coordinate the efforts of multiple craftsmen, manage the logistics of obtaining and transporting expensive materials, and maintain quality control throughout extended production processes. Metalworking during this period achieved levels of sophistication that would not be surpassed for many centuries, as master craftsmen developed advanced techniques for alloying different metals, controlling temperature during smelting and forging processes, and creating complex multi-part objects that combined functional excellence with extraordinary decorative beauty. The golden helmet of Meskelamdug from the Royal Cemetery of Ur demonstrates technical mastery that includes sophisticated understanding of metallurgy, engineering, and artistic design, while also revealing the extent to which luxury objects had become essential symbols of royal authority and social status that required enormous investments of skilled labour and expensive materials. The jewellery and decorative arts that flourished during this period reveal aesthetic sensibilities and technical capabilities that rival the greatest achievements of any civilization in human history, combining precious metals and stones from throughout the known world with sophisticated understanding of design principles, symbolic meaning, and manufacturing techniques that could create objects of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Queen Puabi's elaborate headdress, incorporating gold leaves, carnelian beads, and lapis lazuli in intricate patterns that required months of skilled labour to complete, represents not only individual artistic achievement, but also the existence of extensive trade networks, specialised craft workshops, and social systems that could support the creation of luxury goods on an unprecedented scale. These artistic achievements were paralleled by equally remarkable developments in literature that established many of the fundamental genres, themes, and stylistic techniques that would influence written culture throughout the ancient world and continue to resonate in contemporary literary traditions. The Gilgamesh cycle, which began taking coherent form during this period, represents humanity's first great work of epic literature, combining adventure narrative with profound philosophical meditation on fundamental questions about the meaning of life, the nature of friendship, the inevitability of death, and the proper relationship between individual ambition and social responsibility. The literary sophistication of these early epic narratives reveals the existence of highly developed oral traditions that had been refined over many generations before being preserved in written form, while also demonstrating how literacy had created new possibilities for artistic expression that combined the emotional power of traditional storytelling with the precision and complexity that written language made possible. The Epic of Gilgamesh established narrative techniques, character development strategies, and thematic explorations that would influence literary traditions throughout the ancient world, while also providing insights into Mesopotamian values, beliefs, and cultural assumptions that continue to fascinate readers thousands of years after their original composition. Alongside these epic narratives, scribes and scholars developed increasingly sophisticated wisdom literature that explored moral, philosophical, and practical questions through proverbs, instructional texts, and reflective essays that demonstrate remarkable intellectual maturity and cultural self-awareness. These wisdom texts reveal educational traditions that emphasize not only technical literacy and administrative competence, but also ethical reflection, cultural understanding, and the kind of broad intellectual development that characterized the most advanced educational systems throughout the ancient world. The mathematical innovations that emerged during this period established computational techniques and numerical concepts that would provide the foundation for scientific and engineering achievements throughout Mesopotamian civilization and beyond, while also demonstrating how practical needs for measurement, calculation, and record-keeping had pushed human intellectual capabilities toward increasingly abstract and systematic thinking about quantitative relationships and mathematical principles. The sexagesimal number system that Mesopotamian mathematicians developed during this period, based on multiples of 60, rather than the decimal system that most modern cultures use, proved remarkably effective for both practical calculations and advanced mathematical operations, creating computational frameworks that could handle everything from simple commercial transactions to complex engineering projects and astronomical observations. This mathematical system's sophistication is evidenced by its adoption throughout the ancient world and its continued use in modern timekeeping and angular measurement systems that divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. The development of sophisticated geometric principles and measurement techniques during this period enabled the engineering achievements that transformed Mesopotamian cities into marvels of urban planning, architectural excellence, and technological innovation that provided both practical benefits for daily life and impressive demonstrations of human capability to reshape the natural environment according to deliberate design and systematic planning. The advanced irrigation systems that reached unprecedented sophistication during this period represent perhaps the most remarkable engineering achievements of the early Dynastic III period, as hydraulic engineers developed techniques for water management that could support much larger urban populations, while also increasing agricultural productivity throughout the region. These irrigation networks included not only basic canals and channels, but also sophisticated control systems with locks, reservoirs, and distribution mechanisms that could regulate water flow according to seasonal variations, crop requirements, and urban needs while preventing the salinization problems that had plagued earlier irrigation efforts. The architectural achievements of this period demonstrate equally impressive advances in structural engineering, material science, and aesthetic design that created buildings and urban environments of unprecedented scale, durability, and beauty. The ziggurats that reached their mature architectural form during this period combined religious symbolism with structural innovation to create monuments that served both as centers for divine worship and as impressive demonstrations of human capability to create permanent structures that could withstand the challenges of time, weather, and potential military threats. The international connections that characterized this golden age extended Mesopotamian cultural influence far beyond the traditional boundaries of the region, while also bringing exotic goods, new ideas, and fresh perspectives that enriched local traditions and stimulated further innovation and cultural development. Archaeological evidence reveals trade relationships connecting Mesopotamian cities with the Indus Valley civilization, suggesting regular commercial and cultural exchange across thousands of miles of difficult terrain that required sophisticated organization, transportation technology, and diplomatic arrangements. These long-distance connections brought more than just exotic goods to Mesopotamian cities. They also facilitated the exchange of ideas, techniques, and cultural practices that enriched local traditions while spreading Mesopotamian innovations throughout much of the known world. The standardized weights, measures, and quality controls that facilitated international trade required mathematical precision and administrative sophistication that pushed participating societies toward greater organizational complexity, while the cultural exchanges that accompanied commercial relationships fostered intellectual and artistic developments that benefited all participating civilizations. The social sophistication that developed during this period created daily life experiences that varied dramatically according to social class, occupation, and geographic location, but that generally reflected increasing complexity, cultural refinement, and material prosperity that made possible unprecedented levels of specialization, education, and leisure that allowed significant portions of the population to engage in activities beyond simple survival and basic economic production. The wealthy merchant and administrative families who controlled much of the economic and political activity in major cities enjoyed lifestyles that included elaborate homes with sophisticated architectural features, extensive collections of luxury goods from throughout the known world, and access to educational, cultural, and recreational activities that would have been unimaginable for earlier generations. Their houses, constructed around central courtyards with multiple rooms serving different functions, incorporated advanced ventilation systems, decorative elements, and privacy features that created comfortable and aesthetically pleasing living environments. Middle-class families, skilled craftsmen, minor administrators, and successful farmers experienced significant improvements in their material conditions and social opportunities, with access to better housing, more varied diets, increased educational possibilities for their children, and participation in the rich ceremonial and cultural life that characterized mature urban communities. Their homes, while more modest than those of the wealthy elite, still incorporated architectural innovations and decorative elements that reflected growing prosperity and cultural sophistication. Even working-class families, general labourers, small farmers, and service workers benefited from the general prosperity and social stability that characterized this golden age, with access to more reliable food supplies, better housing than their ancestors had enjoyed, and participation in community festivals, religious ceremonies, and other cultural activities that enriched their daily lives and provided meaningful connections to the broader social and spiritual community. The cultural flowering that characterized this period extended far beyond the production of luxury goods and monumental architecture to encompass intellectual pursuits, artistic experimentation, and social innovations that created rich and varied cultural environments in which human creativity could flourish in unprecedented ways. Schools and libraries preserved and transmitted not only practical knowledge necessary for economic and administrative activities, but also literary works, historical records, and philosophical texts that demonstrated sophisticated engagement with fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the meaning of existence. By 2400 BCE, the achievements of this remarkable golden age had established Mesopotamian civilization as the most advanced and influential culture in the known world, while also creating the intellectual, artistic, and social foundations that would support even greater achievements in the centuries ahead, setting the stage for the next phase of development that would attempt to consolidate these cultural achievements within larger and more stable political structures capable of preserving and extending human civilization to even greater heights of accomplishment and influence. The larger and more stable political structures that seemed necessary to preserve and extend the remarkable cultural achievements of the Golden Age required not only military and administrative capabilities, but also sophisticated legal and social frameworks that could maintain order and justice within increasingly complex urban communities, where traditional kinship-based governance systems had proven inadequate for managing the diverse populations, specialized occupations, and intricate economic relationships that characterized mature Mesopotamian civilization. The founding of the first empires and societies in the ancient world produced urban communities with large centralized populations whose complexity of social order and nature of social hierarchy included elite rulers, priests, merchants and tradespeople, common laborers, and slaves, creating unprecedented challenges for maintaining social cohesion and resolving conflicts that could not be addressed through the informal dispute resolution mechanisms that had sufficed for smaller, simpler communities. The proto-legal systems that emerged during the early dynastic period represented humanity's first systematic attempts to establish formal principles of justice that could be applied consistently across different social groups, geographic regions, and types of disputes, creating institutional frameworks for legal decision-making that would influence governmental and judicial development throughout the ancient world and establish precedents that continue to shape contemporary legal thinking. These early legal innovations did not emerge suddenly or through the inspiration of individual lawmakers, but rather developed gradually as practical solutions to recurring problems that threatened social stability and economic prosperity within the increasingly sophisticated urban environments that had evolved throughout Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence from temple archives and administrative centers reveals extensive collections of legal documents that demonstrate remarkable sophistication in legal reasoning, procedural regularity, and institutional organization that allowed these early urban societies to maintain order and resolve disputes through systematic application of established principles rather than arbitrary decisions by individual authorities. These documents include not only formal legal codes and royal decrees, but also thousands of individual case records, contract negotiations, and dispute resolutions that provide detailed insights into how legal principles were actually implemented in daily practice and how they evolved in response to changing social and economic conditions. The fundamental innovation that distinguished these early Mesopotamian legal systems from the informal justice mechanisms that had characterized smaller communities was the development of compensation principles that provided systematic alternatives to the cycles of retribution and vengeance that had often characterized conflict resolution in tribal societies. Instead of allowing injured parties or their families to seek direct revenge against those who had wronged them, these legal systems established procedures for determining appropriate compensation that could restore social harmony while also providing meaningful remedy for those who had suffered losses or injuries. The sophistication of these compensation principles reveals remarkable understanding of both practical psychology and social dynamics, as legal authorities recognized that sustainable justice required not only punishment of wrongdoers, but also restoration of the social relationships that had been damaged by criminal or negligent behavior. Compensation schedules were carefully calibrated according to the social status of both victims and perpetrators, the severity and consequences of different types of wrongdoing, and the broader social implications of particular disputes, creating systematic approaches to justice that could address individual grievances while also reinforcing community values and social stability. Property concepts that emerged during this period established many of the fundamental principles of land ownership, inheritance, and economic organization that would influence legal and economic development throughout the ancient world and continue to shape contemporary property law and commercial relationships. The recognition of private property rights represented a dramatic departure from the communal ownership patterns that had characterized earlier agricultural communities, reflecting both the increased economic complexity of urban societies and the need for legal frameworks that could encourage individual economic initiative while also maintaining social stability and community welfare. The inheritance systems that developed alongside these property concepts reveal sophisticated understanding of both individual rights and social continuity, as legal authorities attempted to balance the interests of individual property owners in controlling the disposition of their assets with broader community concerns about maintaining social stability and economic productivity across generations. These inheritance laws established detailed procedures for transferring property from parents to children, while also providing protections for widows, orphans, and other vulnerable family members who might otherwise be left without economic support following the death of primary breadwinners. The commercial development that flourished within these legal frameworks created increasingly sophisticated systems for contracts, loans, and business relationships that allowed Mesopotamian economies to support much more complex and extensive commercial activities than had been possible under earlier, less systematic approaches to business regulation. Contract law evolved from simple agreements between individual parties toward comprehensive legal frameworks that could govern multi-party transactions, long-term commercial relationships, and international trade arrangements that extended across cultural and political boundaries. The emergence of systematic interest rates and lending practices during this period reflects both the increasing availability of surplus capital that could be invested in productive activities and the development of legal frameworks that could protect the interests of both lenders and borrowers while facilitating the economic growth that benefited entire communities. These early banking and lending systems established many of the fundamental principles that continue to govern commercial finance today, including standardized interest calculations, collateral requirements, and dispute resolution procedures that could handle the complex financial relationships that characterized mature urban economies. Social protection systems that emerged during this period demonstrate remarkable concern for vulnerable populations that might otherwise have been marginalized or exploited within the competitive urban environments that characterized Mesopotamian civilization. Legal codes from this period include specific provisions for protecting widows, orphans, disabled individuals, and the poor, establishing governmental and community obligations to provide basic support for those who could not maintain themselves through normal economic activities. These social welfare provisions reveal sophisticated understanding of both moral obligations and practical social dynamics, as legal authorities recognized that communities with large numbers of desperate and marginalized individuals would inevitably face problems with crime, social unrest, and economic disruption that could threaten the prosperity and stability that benefited all community members. The social protection systems that developed during this period established institutional mechanisms for providing basic economic support, legal representation, and community integration for vulnerable populations that would influence social welfare thinking throughout the ancient world. Gender dynamics within these legal systems reveal complex and sometimes contradictory attitudes toward women's roles and rights that reflected both traditional cultural assumptions and the practical demands of increasingly sophisticated urban economies that required the productive participation of all community members regardless of gender. Women during this period possessed significant economic rights that allowed them to own property, engage in commercial activities, and participate in legal proceedings as both plaintiffs and defendants, while also remaining subject to various restrictions and limitations that reflected cultural assumptions about appropriate gender roles and family relationships. The most economically active and legally empowered women during this period were typically those from wealthy merchant and administrative families who possessed both the economic resources and social connections necessary to participate effectively in commercial and legal activities, while women from working-class families generally had fewer opportunities for independent economic activity and legal representation. However, even women from modest backgrounds possessed certain legal protections and economic rights that provided them with more security and autonomy than women in many other ancient societies, reflecting the practical recognition that urban economies required the productive participation of all available human resources. The economic sophistication that characterized these legal and social innovations created market systems and trade regulation mechanisms that allowed Mesopotamian commercial activities to expand far beyond anything that had been possible under earlier, less systematic approaches to economic organization. Market regulations established standardized weights and measures, quality control procedures, and dispute resolution mechanisms that created the reliable commercial environments necessary for both local economic activity and international trade relationships. Trade regulation systems that emerged during this period included comprehensive procedures for licensing merchants, registering commercial agreements, collecting customs duties, and resolving disputes between traders from different cities and cultural backgrounds. These regulatory frameworks required sophisticated administrative capabilities and legal expertise that pushed Mesopotamian societies toward greater institutional complexity, while also creating the stable commercial environments that allowed economic prosperity to continue expanding throughout the region. The banking and credit systems that developed within these regulatory frameworks created new possibilities for economic investment and commercial expansion that allowed individual entrepreneurs to undertake larger and more ambitious projects, while also providing communities with institutional mechanisms for mobilizing surplus capital for productive purposes. These early financial institutions established many of the fundamental principles of commercial banking that continue to influence economic organization today, including systematic procedures for evaluating creditworthiness, managing risk, and providing financial services that could support both individual economic advancement and broader community prosperity. By 2350 BCE, the sophisticated legal, social, and economic systems that had evolved to support Mesopotamian urban civilization would face their greatest test, when natural forces beyond human control created challenges that no amount of legal sophistication or administrative competence could prevent, as geological and climatological evidence reveals that a catastrophic flooding event swept across much of Mesopotamia during this period, destroying cities, disrupting agricultural systems, and creating social and political chaos that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of regional development for centuries to come. Archaeological evidence from excavation sites throughout Mesopotamia provides compelling documentation of flood layers that appear consistently across multiple cities and regions during this period, revealing the extent and severity of the natural disaster that contemporary populations experienced as a world-ending catastrophe that threatened the very foundations of civilized life. These flood deposits, which can be clearly distinguished from the normal seasonal flooding that characterize Mesopotamian agricultural cycles, contain debris, silt, and structural remains that indicate water levels far exceeding anything that had been recorded in human memory, creating destruction that overwhelmed even the sophisticated flood control and irrigation systems that had been developed over many centuries of hydraulic engineering. The uniformity and extent of these archaeological flood layers across such a wide geographic area suggests that this catastrophic event resulted from extraordinary climatological conditions, possibly involving unprecedented rainfall, unusual river behaviors, or dam breaks that released enormous volumes of water across the landscape simultaneously. The scale of destruction evidenced in the archaeological record indicates that this was not simply an unusually severe example of the normal flooding that Mesopotamian communities had learned to manage, but rather a genuinely unprecedented natural disaster that exceeded the capacity of existing infrastructure, social institutions, and emergency response systems to provide effective protection for urban populations. The mythological preservation of this traumatic experience in Sumerian deluge narratives reveals how these ancient communities processed and understood catastrophic events that challenged their fundamental assumptions about divine protection, human security, and the reliability of the natural systems upon which their civilization depended. The flood stories that emerge from this period represent some of humanity's earliest attempts to create meaningful explanations for devastating experiences that seem to threaten the basic assumptions about cosmic order and divine justice that provided the foundation for civilized life and social cooperation. These Sumerian flood narratives established narrative patterns and thematic elements that would influence flood mythology throughout the ancient world and continue to resonate in contemporary religious and literary traditions, demonstrating how traumatic collective experiences create cultural memories that transcend their immediate historical contexts to become fundamental elements of human understanding about the relationship between natural forces, divine authority, and human vulnerability. The Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra, who saved human and animal life through divine warning and careful preparation, established character types and narrative structures that would appear in flood stories from cultures throughout the region and beyond. The cultural recovery processes that followed this catastrophic flooding reveal remarkable resilience and adaptability as surviving communities developed new approaches to urban planning, flood control, and social organization that could better withstand future natural disasters while preserving the essential achievements of Mesopotamian civilization. Archaeological evidence shows that cities were rebuilt with improved drainage systems, elevated foundations, and more sophisticated flood protection measures that reflected hard-earned understanding of the limitations of previous infrastructure designs. The rebuilding efforts that characterized this recovery period required unprecedented levels of cooperation and resource sharing between communities that had previously been political and economic rivals, as the scale of destruction made it impossible for individual cities to recover effectively through their own resources alone. This necessity for cooperative recovery efforts created new forms of political relationship and administrative coordination that would prove crucial for the larger political unification movements that would emerge in subsequent decades. The literary legacy that emerged from these flood experiences extended far beyond Mesopotamia to influence flood narratives throughout the ancient world, suggesting that the cultural processing of this traumatic event created mythological and narrative frameworks that proved meaningful and relevant for human societies throughout different regions and historical periods. The influence of Mesopotamian flood narratives can be traced through subsequent literary traditions, including the biblical account of Noah's flood, Greek flood myths, and flood stories from cultures as distant as India and the Americas. The psychological and cultural mechanisms through which these flood narratives achieved such widespread influence reveal fundamental aspects of how human societies create and preserve collective memories of traumatic experiences, transforming specific historical events into universal stories that address enduring human concerns about survival, divine justice, moral responsibility, and the relationship between human civilization and natural forces. These flood stories became vehicles for exploring philosophical and theological questions about the meaning of suffering, the purposes of divine intervention, and the responsibilities of human beings to maintain moral behavior that deserves divine protection. The collective memory formation that resulted from this catastrophic experience demonstrates how traumatic events can create shared cultural narratives that transcend their immediate historical contexts to become foundational elements of community identity and cultural understanding that influence social behavior, political decision-making, and religious belief for many generations after the original events. The flood memories that developed during this period became essential components of Mesopotamian cultural identity that shaped subsequent historical consciousness and influenced how later generations understood their relationship with both natural and divine forces. The historical transition that followed this period of catastrophic flooding and cultural trauma created conditions of political fragmentation and institutional disruption that would paradoxically provide opportunities for new forms of political organization and cultural synthesis that had not been possible under the stable but competitive city-state system that had characterized the previous period. The destruction of established power structures and the necessity for cooperative recovery efforts created possibilities for political innovation and territorial consolidation that would soon be exploited by ambitious leaders with vision for creating larger and more stable political entities. The fragmentation that initially resulted from flood damage and social disruption created power vacuums and institutional weaknesses that would prove to be crucial opportunities for the political entrepreneurs and military leaders who would soon attempt to unite the scattered and weakened city-states under centralized imperial authority that could provide both greater security against future disasters and more effective coordination of the resources necessary for regional recovery and development. The stage was now set for the emergence of the world's first true empires as the limitations of the city-state system had become apparent and the necessity for larger-scale political organization had been dramatically demonstrated by the inadequacy of existing institutions to provide effective protection against the natural and social challenges that threatened the survival of Mesopotamian civilization itself. The power vacuums and institutional weaknesses that had been created by flood damage and social disruption would indeed prove to be crucial opportunities for the most remarkable political entrepreneur in early Mesopotamian history, a man whose very name has become synonymous with the concept of imperial authority and whose achievements would echo through thousands of years of subsequent political development. Around 2334 BCE, as the weakened city-states of Mesopotamia struggled to rebuild their shattered infrastructure and restore their disrupted social systems, an individual emerged from the most humble possible origins to reshape not just the political landscape of the region, but the entire concept of how human societies could be organized and governed on a scale that had never before been attempted or achieved. The legendary origins of this transformative figure reveal the extent to which extraordinary political achievement could transcend even the most disadvantaged social circumstances in the fluid environment that characterized post-flood Mesopotamia. According to the autobiographical account preserved in cuneiform tablets discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal, the man who would become known to history as Sargon of Akkad began life under conditions that seemed to offer no possibility whatsoever for political advancement or social prominence. His mother was described as a changeling, possibly a temple priestess of the goddess Inanna, whose religious obligations prevented her from raising children openly, while his father remained completely unknown, creating circumstances that left the infant without family connections, social status, or economic resources that might have provided pathways toward conventional success. The foundling myth that surrounds Sargon's earliest years established narrative patterns that would later influence stories of heroic leaders throughout the ancient world and continue to resonate in contemporary political mythology. According to his own account, preserved in The Legend of Sargon of Akkad, his mother conceived me in secret, she gave birth to me in concealment, she set me in a basket of rushes, she sealed the lid with tar, she cast me into the river, but it did not rise over me, the water carried me to Aki, the drawer of water. This dramatic story of abandonment and salvation established Sargon as a figure whose very survival demonstrated divine favour and whose rise to power could be understood as the fulfilment of cosmic destiny rather than mere political opportunism. The humble circumstances of Sargon's upbringing under the care of Aki, who served as gardener for the palace of Kish, provided him with first-hand experience of the working conditions and social perspectives of the common people who comprise the vast majority of Mesopotamian urban populations. This background would prove crucial for his later political success, as his understanding of popular grievances and aspirations allowed him to appeal to broader social constituencies than the traditional ruling elites who had typically dominated city-state politics through hereditary privilege and religious authority, rather than demonstrated competence or popular support. Sargon's gradual rise within the palace hierarchy of Kish demonstrated remarkable personal capabilities that allowed him to advance from his position as an adopted gardener's son to become the trusted cupbearer of King Ur-Zababa. In ancient Mesopotamian court systems, the role of cupbearer represented far more than simple service duties. These individuals functioned as close advisors and confidential agents who possessed intimate access to royal decision-making processes and detailed knowledge of governmental operations that would prove invaluable for anyone with political ambitions. Sargon's appointment to this prestigious position indicated that he had already demonstrated exceptional intelligence, reliability, and administrative competence that distinguished him from other court personnel and brought him to the favourable attention of the king himself. The political opportunity that allowed Sargon to transform his court position into genuine political power emerged from the very patterns of city-state weakness and fragmentation that had been exacerbated by the catastrophic flooding and social disruption of the previous decades. The competitive pressures and territorial conflicts that had characterized the early dynastic period had been intensified rather than resolved by the recovery efforts following the Great Floods, as cities struggled to rebuild their infrastructure while also defending their interests against neighbours who might attempt to exploit their temporary vulnerabilities. The specific crisis that provided Sargon with his opportunity involved the expansionist campaigns of Lugal-Zaggisi of Uruk, who had been systematically conquering Sumerian city-states and attempting to create a unified kingdom under his own authority. When Lugal-Zaggisi's forces approached Kish, King Ur-Zababa became so frightened by reports of the conqueror's military prowess that he apparently lost control of his bodily functions, described in contemporary texts as having sprinkled his legs in terror. This display of royal weakness created exactly the kind of legitimacy crisis that ambitious subordinates throughout history have exploited to justify their own claims to leadership. Ur-Zababa's decision to send Sargon to Lugal-Zaggisi with what was apparently intended to be a request for the young cupbearer's assassination backfired spectacularly when Lugal-Zaggisi instead invited Sargon to join his forces. Whether this invitation reflected Lugal-Zaggisi's recognition of Sargon's capabilities, his desire to gain intelligence about Kish's defences, or simply his refusal to comply with Ur-Zababa's treacherous request, the result was a strategic alliance that allowed Sargon to combine his intimate knowledge of Kish's weaknesses with access to the military resources necessary to exploit those weaknesses effectively. The rapid dissolution of the alliance between Sargon and Lugal-Zaggisi demonstrates how quickly political relationships could shift in the fluid environment that characterized this period of Mesopotamian history. Whatever personal or political factors led to their falling out, The conflict that resulted allowed Sargon to demonstrate military capabilities that would revolutionize both tactical warfare and strategic thinking about how political power could be achieved and maintained on a regional rather than merely local scale. Sargon's military genius manifested itself not only in his personal leadership abilities and tactical innovations, but also in his recognition that the traditional city-state military systems were fundamentally inadequate for the kind of large-scale, sustained warfare that would be necessary to achieve genuine political unification across the diverse and scattered communities of Mesopotamia. The militia-based armies that had characterized earlier military conflicts were composed primarily of part-time citizen soldiers who could be mobilized for brief campaigns but lacked the training, equipment, and organizational structure necessary for extended operations across vast territories and against multiple enemies simultaneously. The professional army that Sargon created represented humanity's first systematic attempt to develop military forces specifically designed for empire building rather than simple city-state defense. Unlike the traditional armies that numbered at most a few thousand troops and could remain in the field for only limited periods, Sargon's forces included a personal guard of 5,400 men who ate bread daily before him, indicating a permanent professional military establishment that could be maintained continuously, rather than assembled only during emergencies. This professional corps provided the foundation for larger armies that could conduct systematic campaigns of conquest, while also maintaining garrison forces in conquered territories and defending supply lines across extended distances. The tactical innovations that Sargon introduced transformed both the composition and deployment of Mesopotamian military forces in ways that provided decisive advantages over traditional army organizations. His infantry formations employed deeper phalanxes, 6 men deep rather than the shallower lines that had been standard armed with pikes and axes, with front ranks carrying large rectangular shields that provided better protection against enemy missiles. More importantly, he trained his forces to fight in looser formations that could adapt to rough or broken terrain, providing tactical flexibility that traditional rigid phalanx formations could not match. Perhaps most significantly, Sargon's military innovations included the systematic deployment of large archer units that could deliver concentrated missile fire capable of disrupting enemy formations before close combat began. The effectiveness of these archery tactics was such that contemporary observers noted how the Akkadian bow and arrow overcame the Sumerian lance and shield, demonstrating how technological and tactical innovation could provide decisive advantages even against numerically superior traditional forces. The professional training and coordination that these tactics required could only be achieved through the kind of permanent military establishment that Sargon had created, giving his forces capabilities that part-time militias could never develop or maintain. The systematic conquest that followed Sargon's initial victories against Lugal-Zagsi demonstrated strategic thinking and organizational capabilities that extended far beyond simple military success to encompass comprehensive planning for long-term political control and administrative integration. Rather than following the traditional pattern of seasonal campaigns followed by withdrawal to home territories, Sargon conducted sustained operations that methodically conquered and occupied territory while establishing permanent control systems that could maintain his authority even after his armies moved on to new targets. The geographical scope of Sargon's conquests reveals the unprecedented scale of his imperial ambitions, and his understanding that genuine political unification would require control not just of the traditional Mesopotamian heartland, but also of the trade routes, resource sources, and strategic positions that connected the region with the broader ancient world. His campaigns extended from the Persian Gulf in the south to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, encompassing not only all of Mesopotamia proper, but also parts of modern Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iran, creating an empire that covered approximately 250,000 square miles and included dozens of different ethnic, linguistic, and cultural groups. The administrative brilliance that Sargon demonstrated in governing this vast and diverse empire represented innovations that would influence governmental development throughout the ancient world, and establish many of the fundamental principles of imperial administration that continue to shape political organization today. Rather than attempting to rule through traditional vassal-king relationships that had characterized earlier attempts at regional hegemony, Sargon systematically replaced local rulers with governors, appointed directly by the central authority and responsible for implementing imperial policies rather than pursuing independent political agendas. This governor system represented a revolutionary departure from traditional political relationships that had been based on personal loyalties, kinship connections, and religious obligations toward more systematic administrative structures that could function effectively across cultural boundaries and vast geographic distances. The governors that Sargon appointed were typically trusted supporters from his own ethnic and cultural background, who could be relied upon to implement imperial policies faithfully, while also possessing the administrative expertise necessary to manage complex local economies and social systems. The cultural integration that Sargon achieved through this administrative system involved careful balance between imperial standardization and local autonomy that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both practical governmental needs and cultural sensitivities. While Akkadian became the official language of government administration throughout the empire, Sumerian continued to be used for religious and literary purposes, allowing local communities to maintain their cultural traditions while also participating in the broader imperial system. This linguistic policy created conditions that facilitated both administrative efficiency and cultural continuity, preventing the kind of cultural resistance that might have destabilized imperial control, while also promoting the communication and standardization necessary for effective governance. The imperial ideology that emerged from these practical administrative arrangements established concepts of universal rulership that would influence political thinking throughout the ancient world and continue to shape governmental philosophy even today. Sargon's official titles, including King of Akkad, King of Kish, King of the Land, and eventually King of the World, reflected unprecedented claims to political authority that transcended traditional city-state boundaries and ethnic loyalties to encompass universal jurisdiction over all inhabited territories. These ideological innovations provided intellectual frameworks that could justify imperial authority, while also creating expectations for imperial behavior that emphasized justice, prosperity, and protection for all subjects regardless of their ethnic or cultural backgrounds. The divine sanction that Sargon claimed for his imperial authority involved careful synthesis of Akkadian and Sumerian religious traditions that created new forms of political legitimacy while respecting established religious practices and beliefs. His special relationship with the goddess Ishtar, Inanna, provided divine authorization for his conquests, while his respect for traditional Sumerian deities like Enlil demonstrated cultural sensitivity that helped maintain social stability throughout the empire. This religious policy established precedents for imperial governance that balanced innovation with tradition in ways that would be copied by subsequent empire builders throughout the ancient world. The cultural transformation that began during Sargon's reign represented the emergence of genuinely cosmopolitan civilization that combined the best achievements of different cultural traditions, while also creating new forms of artistic, intellectual, and social expression that reflected the unprecedented diversity and complexity of imperial society. The Akkadian-Sumerian synthesis that characterized this cultural development involved far more than simple political amalgamation. It created new possibilities for human achievement that drew upon the accumulated wisdom and capabilities of multiple civilizations while also fostering innovations that neither culture could have achieved independently. By 2279 BCE, when Sargon's remarkable 55-year reign came to an end, he had not only created the world's first true empire, but had also established governmental, military, and cultural precedents that would influence human political development for thousands of years to come. The imperial system that he created would provide the foundation for all subsequent Mesopotamian political development, while his personal legend would inspire empire builders throughout the ancient world who sought to emulate his unprecedented achievement in transforming the political landscape through vision, capability, and determination that could overcome even the most disadvantaged social origins. The imperial system that Sargon had established through his extraordinary vision and revolutionary capabilities would reach its full maturation under his successors, who inherited not only the governmental structures and military resources that the great founder had created, but also the imperial ideology and cultural frameworks that would allow the Akkadian Empire to achieve levels of territorial control, economic integration, and cultural synthesis that would not be equalled for many centuries to come. The death of Sargon, around 2279 BCE, marked not the beginning of imperial decline, but rather the transition toward an even more sophisticated and comprehensive form of empire building that would demonstrate the full potential of the political and administrative innovations that the founding emperor had pioneered through his remarkable 55-year reign. Under the leadership of Sargon's successors, particularly his grandson Naram-Sin, who would prove to be one of the most capable and ambitious rulers in ancient Mesopotamian history, the Akkadian Empire expanded its territorial control far beyond even Sargon's impressive conquests, to encompass virtually all of the known world from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea and from the Zagros Mountains to the Anatolian Plateau. This unprecedented territorial expansion represented more than simple military conquest. It reflected sophisticated strategic thinking about how genuine imperial control could be maintained across vast distances and diverse populations through systematic integration of economic, cultural, and administrative systems that could function effectively regardless of local variations in language, religion, or traditional social organization. The Persian Gulf region, which had been incorporated into the empire during Sargon's reign primarily for its commercial and strategic value, became during this period a fully integrated component of the imperial economy that contributed not only exotic goods and maritime trade connections, but also technological innovations and cultural influences that enriched the broader imperial civilization. The sophisticated navigation techniques, shipbuilding expertise, and commercial practices that had been developed by Gulf maritime communities were systematically incorporated into imperial operations, allowing Akkadian merchants and administrators to extend their influence throughout the Indian Ocean trading networks that connected Mesopotamia with the distant civilizations of the Indus Valley and beyond. The Mediterranean territories that came under Akkadian control during this period included not only the Levantine coast with its important commercial cities, but also inland regions that controlled crucial trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia, Egypt, and the Aegean world. The systematic integration of these diverse territories required administrative innovations that could accommodate dramatically different environmental conditions, economic systems, and cultural traditions while maintaining the standardization and coordination necessary for effective imperial governance across such vast geographic scales. The cultural fusion that characterized this imperial golden age involved far more than simple political amalgamation or administrative coordination. It represented the emergence of genuinely cosmopolitan civilization that combined the accumulated achievements of multiple cultural traditions while also fostering entirely new forms of artistic, intellectual, and social expression that reflected the unprecedented diversity and complexity of imperial society. The blending of Sumerian and Akkadian traditions that had begun during Sargon's reign evolved during this period into comprehensive cultural synthesis that created new possibilities for human achievement in every field of endeavor, from art and literature to science and technology. The Sumerian intellectual and religious traditions that had provided the foundation for Mesopotamian civilization were not displaced or diminished by Akkadian imperial expansion, but rather were preserved, refined, and disseminated throughout the empire in ways that enriched both Akkadian and local cultural developments. Sumerian remained the language of scholarship, religious ceremony, and high literature throughout the empire, while Akkadian served as the administrative and commercial lingua franca that allowed people from different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds to participate in the broader imperial system without abandoning their local cultural identities. This linguistic policy reflected sophisticated understanding of both practical administrative needs and cultural sensitivities that would influence imperial governance strategies throughout the ancient world. By maintaining Sumerian as the language of high culture while promoting Akkadian as the language of practical communication, imperial authorities created conditions that facilitated both cultural continuity and imperial integration, preventing the kind of cultural resistance that might have destabilized imperial control, while also promoting the standardization and communication necessary for effective governance across diverse populations. The economic integration that reached unprecedented sophistication during this period involved the development of standardized weights, measures, and currency systems that allowed commercial activities to function efficiently across the entire imperial territory, regardless of local variations in traditional trading practices or measurement systems. This standardization represented one of humanity's first experiments with large-scale economic integration that transcended ethnic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries to create genuinely international commercial systems that could support complex manufacturing, trade, and financial activities across vast geographic regions. The imperial currency that was introduced during this period consisted primarily of standardized silver ingots that could be used for major transactions, supplemented by standardized weights of barley and other commodities that could serve as currency for smaller commercial activities. This dual currency system reflected sophisticated understanding of both practical commercial needs and local economic conditions, providing sufficient flexibility to accommodate different types of transactions, while also maintaining the standardization necessary for imperial-wide commercial integration. The commercial networks that flourished under these standardized systems extended far beyond the formal boundaries of the empire to connect Akkadian territories with trading partners throughout the known world, creating economic relationships that brought both prosperity and cultural influence to participating communities, while also generating the revenues necessary to support the imperial military, administrative, and cultural activities that maintained political control and social stability across such diverse and far-flung territories. The artistic propaganda that characterized this imperial golden age demonstrated remarkable sophistication in both technical execution and symbolic communication, as imperial artists developed new forms of visual expression that could communicate complex messages about imperial power, divine authority, and cultural achievement to audiences that included both literate elites and illiterate common people throughout the diverse communities that comprise the empire. The monumental sculptures, architectural decorations, and ceremonial objects that were created during this period established artistic standards and iconographic conventions that would influence visual culture throughout the ancient world for thousands of years to come. The victory steles and commemorative monuments that celebrated imperial military achievements represented new forms of historical documentation that combined artistic excellence with detailed narrative information about specific campaigns, conquests, and administrative accomplishments. These monuments served both as artistic achievements and as permanent records of imperial success that could communicate imperial ideology and demonstrate imperial capabilities to both contemporary audiences and future generations who might question imperial authority or imperial competence. The relief sculptures and architectural decorations that adorned imperial palaces, temples, and administrative buildings throughout the empire established visual vocabularies that could communicate imperial messages across linguistic and cultural barriers, while also demonstrating the artistic capabilities and cultural sophistication that imperial authorities wished to associate with Akkadian rule. These artistic innovations required not only individual artistic genius, but also sophisticated workshop organizations, extensive resource networks, and systematic quality control that could maintain artistic standards across multiple production sites and cultural contexts. The religious diplomacy that allowed the empire to maintain stability and legitimacy across such diverse populations involved careful balance between imperial religious authority and local religious traditions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both practical political needs and genuine spiritual concerns. Rather than attempting to impose a single imperial religion upon all subject populations, Akkadian authorities developed inclusive religious policies that honored local deities and traditional practices, while also promoting imperial gods and religious concepts that could provide overarching frameworks for imperial unity and divine sanction. This religious inclusivity created conditions that allowed local communities to maintain their cultural and spiritual identities while also participating in broader imperial religious activities that reinforced political loyalties and social cohesion across ethnic and linguistic boundaries. Imperial religious ceremonies incorporated elements from multiple traditional systems, while also introducing new religious concepts and practices that reflected the unprecedented scale and diversity of imperial society. The promotion of Akkadian deities like Ishtar throughout the empire involved not the displacement of local gods, but rather the creation of religious syntheses that identified Akkadian deities with local divine figures, while also expanding local religious understanding to encompass the broader cosmic responsibilities and capabilities that were associated with imperial divine authority. This religious synthesis created new possibilities for spiritual development and religious understanding that enriched both imperial and local religious traditions. The unprecedented royal divine claims that reached their fullest expression under Naram-Sin represented the logical culmination of imperial ideology that had been developing since Sargon's reign, but also reflected specific political and cultural conditions that made such extraordinary claims both possible and necessary for maintaining imperial authority across the vast and diverse territories that comprised the mature Akkadian Empire. Naram-Sin's decision to declare himself a god represented not mere personal ambition or psychological megalomania, but rather sophisticated political calculation about how imperial authority could be maintained and legitimized in an environment where traditional sources of political legitimacy were inadequate for the unprecedented challenges of universal rule. The divine titles that Naram-Sin adopted, including God of Akkad and King of the Four Quarters of the Universe, reflected both practical political needs and genuine religious beliefs that had evolved from earlier concepts of divine mandate and royal authority. By claiming divine status for himself, Naram-Sin created new forms of political legitimacy that could transcend traditional ethnic, linguistic, and cultural loyalties, while also providing ideological frameworks that could justify imperial authority over populations that had no traditional political connection to Akkadian rule. The administrative sophistication that was necessary to manage such a vast and diverse empire represented some of the most remarkable organizational achievements in human history. As imperial authorities developed governmental systems that could maintain effective control and coordination across territories that encompassed dozens of different ethnic groups, multiple climate zones and economic systems that range from nomadic pastoralism to sophisticated urban manufacturing. The administrative innovations that emerged during this period established many of the fundamental principles of imperial governance that would influence political development throughout the ancient world and continue to shape governmental thinking even today. The provincial system that reached its full development during this period involved the systematic division of imperial territory into administrative units that could be managed effectively by appointed governors who possessed both the authority and the resources necessary to maintain imperial control while also addressing local needs and concerns that required intimate knowledge of regional conditions and cultural sensitivities. These provincial governors were typically selected from among the most capable and trusted members of the imperial administration, but they were also required to work closely with local traditional authorities who could provide cultural expertise and popular legitimacy that purely external administrators could never achieve. The communication systems that connected these far-flung provinces with the imperial capital represented unprecedented achievements in organizational logistics that required systematic development of road networks, courier services, and standardized administrative procedures that could ensure reliable information flow and policy coordination across distances that had never before been successfully managed by any human organization. The royal road system that connected major administrative centers allowed messages and personnel to travel from the imperial capital to distant provinces in a matter of weeks rather than months, creating possibilities for centralized coordination and control that would not be equaled for many centuries. The very administrative sophistication and territorial extent that had made the Akkadian Empire humanity's most remarkable political achievement would also prove to be the sources of structural weaknesses that would ultimately make the empire vulnerable to challenges that no amount of organizational expertise or military capability could successfully address, as the success of imperial expansion had created logistical, economic and social pressures that would gradually overwhelm even the most advanced governmental systems that ancient technology and administrative methods could support. By 2218 BCE, the strains that had been building within the imperial system throughout decades of territorial expansion and administrative complexity began manifesting themselves in ways that would test the fundamental viability of large-scale political organization under ancient conditions. The administrative overstretch that characterized the final decades of Akkadian imperial control reflected the inherent limitations of ancient communication and transportation technology that made it increasingly difficult to maintain effective coordination between the imperial capital and the distant provinces that had been incorporated during the empire's period of maximum territorial expansion. The distances that separated Akkad from territories along the Mediterranean coast, in the Zagros Mountains or along the Persian Gulf, created communication delays that could extend for weeks or even months, making it virtually impossible for central authorities to respond quickly to local crises or to maintain the kind of detailed oversight that effective imperial governance required. These communication challenges were compounded by the cultural and linguistic diversity that had been one of the empire's greatest achievements during its golden age, but that also created administrative complexities that became increasingly difficult to manage as imperial resources became strained and local populations began questioning the benefits of imperial membership. The multilingual administrative systems that had been necessary to govern diverse populations effectively required extensive translation services, cultural mediation, and specialized personnel who possessed both linguistic capabilities and cultural sensitivity, all of which represented significant ongoing costs that diverted resources from other essential imperial activities. The governor system that had been crucial for imperial success during the expansion period began creating more problems than it solved, as communication delays and resource limitations made it increasingly difficult to maintain effective supervision of provincial administrators who possessed enormous practical authority, but whose loyalty and competence could not be adequately monitored from the distant imperial capital. Some governors began pursuing independent policies that served their own interests or local constituencies rather than imperial objectives, while others proved simply incompetent or corrupt in ways that created local problems that could escalate into broader challenges to imperial authority. The economic strain that gradually undermined imperial stability reflected both the enormous ongoing costs of maintaining such an extensive administrative and military system, and the diminishing returns that characterized territorial expansion beyond the optimal size for ancient imperial organization. The military forces necessary to defend imperial borders and suppress internal rebellions required constant funding that placed increasing pressure on imperial tax collection systems, while the administrative apparatus necessary to govern such diverse territories required personnel and resources that grew exponentially rather than proportionally as imperial territory expanded. The taxation systems that had been adequate during the early phases of imperial development proved increasingly inadequate as territorial expansion created both higher costs and greater resistance to tax collection from populations who began questioning whether imperial membership provided sufficient benefits to justify the fiscal burdens that were being imposed upon them. Tax collection became increasingly dependent upon military coercion rather than voluntary compliance, creating cycles of resistance and suppression that consumed ever larger portions of imperial resources while also generating popular resentment that could be exploited by potential rebels or external enemies. The military costs that absorbed increasing proportions of imperial resources reflected both the growing challenges of defending extensive borders against external threats and the increasing frequency of internal rebellions that required expensive suppression campaigns. The professional army that had been one of Sargon's most important innovations required continuous funding for personnel, equipment, training, and logistical support that became more expensive as military technology became more sophisticated and as the territorial extent of the empire created greater logistical challenges for military operations. The external pressures that increasingly threatened imperial security came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating strategic challenges that stretched imperial military resources beyond their effective capacity and forced imperial authorities to make difficult choices between defending different threatened territories. The most serious of these external threats came from the Gutian peoples from the Zagros Mountains, who began conducting increasingly bold raids into Mesopotamian territory and eventually launched systematic invasion campaigns that proved beyond the empire's capacity to repel. The Gutian invasions represented more than simple barbarian raids. They reflected strategic military campaigns conducted by organized societies that had observed imperial weaknesses and recognized opportunities to exploit imperial vulnerabilities for their own territorial and economic advancement. The mountain peoples who participated in these invasions possessed military advantages in terms of mobility, local knowledge, and strategic flexibility that allowed them to avoid the kind of large-scale battles where imperial armies might have maintained superiority, while instead conducting guerrilla warfare and hit-and-run tactics that gradually wore down imperial defensive capabilities. The success of these external invasions was facilitated by the internal problems that had weakened imperial military effectiveness and reduced the resources available for border defense. Local populations that had become disaffected with imperial rule sometimes collaborated with external invaders rather than supporting imperial defense efforts, while provincial governors who had lost confidence in central authority sometimes attempted to negotiate independent arrangements with invading forces rather than coordinating unified resistance efforts. The climate crisis that struck Mesopotamia during this period created environmental challenges that would have tested any governmental system, but that proved particularly devastating for an empire whose stability depended upon maintaining agricultural productivity across diverse territories, while also supporting large urban populations and expensive military and administrative establishments. Archaeological evidence reveals a severe drought that lasted for several decades and that dramatically reduced agricultural yields throughout the empire, creating food shortages that led to social unrest, population movements, and fiscal crises that further weakened imperial capacity to address other challenges. The agricultural failure that resulted from this climatic disruption affected not only food production for direct consumption, but also the agricultural surpluses that provided the economic foundation for imperial taxation, commercial activity, and urban population support. Cities that had flourished during the imperial golden age found themselves unable to maintain their populations, as rural areas could no longer provide sufficient food supplies, leading to urban decline, commercial disruption, and the breakdown of economic networks that had been essential for imperial integration and prosperity. The demographic changes that resulted from agricultural failure and economic disruption included both voluntary migration, as people sought better opportunities in less affected regions, and involuntary population movements as entire communities were forced to abandon traditional territories that could no longer support them. These population movements created refugee problems, territorial conflicts, and cultural disruptions that further strained imperial administrative and military resources, while also breaking down the social stability that had been essential for imperial governance. The internal fragmentation that accelerated during this period of multiple crises reflected both the practical breakdown of imperial administrative systems and the erosion of popular loyalty and elite confidence that had provided the political foundation for imperial authority. provincial independence movements emerged throughout the empire as local leaders concluded that they could better serve their population's interests through autonomous governance, rather than continued participation in an imperial system that seemed increasingly unable to provide effective protection or beneficial services. These independence movements were facilitated by the very administrative and military expertise that the empire had developed during its successful period, as provincial governors and military commanders possessed both the governmental capabilities and the military resources necessary to establish independent political entities that could function effectively without imperial coordination. The success of early independence movements encouraged similar efforts in other provinces, creating cascading effects that accelerated imperial dissolution once the process of fragmentation had begun. The ideological crisis that accompanied these practical failures involved the breakdown of imperial legitimacy that had been based upon demonstrated imperial effectiveness in providing security, prosperity, and cultural leadership for subject populations. When imperial authorities proved unable to address the practical challenges that threatened community welfare, the divine mandate and cultural superiority claims that had justified imperial authority began to seem hollow and unconvincing, creating opportunities for alternative political authorities to establish rival legitimacy claims. The systematic breakdown that characterized the final phase of Akkadian imperial collapse involved not simply military defeat or administrative failure, but the comprehensive dissolution of the economic, social, and cultural networks that had integrated diverse populations under imperial authority. Trade relationships that had connected distant territories were disrupted by military conflicts and political uncertainties, while cultural and intellectual exchanges that had enriched imperial civilization declined as communities became focused on immediate survival rather than broader cultural participation. The final dissolution of the imperial system that had dominated Mesopotamian political development for over a century created unexpected opportunities for cultural renewal and artistic achievement that would demonstrate how creative human energies could flourish even in the aftermath of political catastrophe and social disruption. As local communities throughout the region began developing new approaches to governance, cultural expression, and international relationships that preserved the most valuable achievements of imperial civilization, while avoiding the structural problems that had led to imperial collapse. The most remarkable example of this post-imperial cultural renaissance emerged in the city-state of Lagash under the leadership of Gudea, whose 50-year reign would produce some of the finest achievements in Mesopotamian art, literature, and religious architecture, while also demonstrating how traditional city-state governance could be revitalized and adapted to address the challenges and opportunities of the post-imperial environment. Gudea's rise to power in Lagash around 2050 BCE reflected both the opportunities for local leadership that had been created by imperial collapse and the particular advantages that Lagash possessed for independent development during this period of regional political fragmentation. The city's location in the fertile agricultural region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers had been less affected by the climatic disruptions that had contributed to imperial collapse, while its traditional expertise in irrigation engineering and water management provided both economic advantages and technical capabilities that would prove crucial for recovery and prosperity in the new political environment. The artistic flowering that characterized Gudea's reign represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of Mesopotamian visual culture, as artists working under his patronage created sculptural masterpieces that combined technical excellence with profound spiritual expression in ways that would influence artistic development throughout the ancient world for many centuries to come. The numerous diorite statues of Gudea that have been preserved reveal not only extraordinary skill in stone carving, but also sophisticated understanding of artistic composition, symbolic communication, and aesthetic beauty that reflected both individual artistic genius and cultural traditions that valued artistic achievement as essential components of civilized life. These sculptural achievements required not only individual artistic talent, but also access to expensive materials, sophisticated workshop organization, and cultural patronage systems that could support artists throughout the extended periods necessary for completing major works. The diorite stone used for Gudea's statues was imported from distant quarries, requiring trade relationships and transportation capabilities that demonstrated Lagash's continued participation in international commercial networks, despite the breakdown of imperial political structures that had previously coordinated such activities. The artistic style that emerged during Gudea's reign established new conventions for royal portraiture and religious sculpture that emphasized spiritual devotion and intellectual sophistication rather than military prowess or political domination, reflecting both Gudea's personal religious commitments and broader cultural values that had developed in response to the failures of imperial military and political approaches. The serene expressions and contemplative poses that characterize Gudea's portraits communicate messages about the proper relationship between earthly authority and divine wisdom that would influence royal ideology throughout Mesopotamian history. The literary accomplishments that emerged during this period included some of the most sophisticated and personally revealing texts in ancient Mesopotamian literature, as Gudea commissioned detailed inscriptions that described not only his building projects and political achievements, but also his religious experiences, divine dreams, and personal reflections on the responsibilities of leadership in ways that provide unprecedented insights into the intellectual and spiritual life of an ancient Mesopotamian ruler. These inscriptions demonstrate literary sophistication that rivals the greatest achievements of any period in Mesopotamian cultural development, while also revealing cultural values and personal perspectives that had been shaped by both traditional Sumerian religious thinking and the experiences of imperial rise and collapse. The divine dreams that Gudea recorded in his inscriptions reveal sophisticated understanding of religious experience that combined traditional Mesopotamian theology with personal spiritual insights that reflected both individual religious development and broader cultural attempts to understand the relationship between divine authority and human responsibility in the aftermath of imperial failure. These dream narratives established literary conventions for describing divine communication that would influence religious literature throughout the ancient world, while also providing models for personal religious experience that emphasized humility, service, and devotional commitment rather than political ambition or military conquest. The detailed accounts of temple construction projects that comprise much of Gudea's inscriptional literature demonstrate both practical expertise in architectural planning and engineering, and sophisticated understanding of religious architecture as symbolic communication that could express complex theological concepts through physical structures designed to facilitate both divine worship and human spiritual development. The precision with which these building accounts describe construction techniques, material specifications, and symbolic meanings reveals administrative and intellectual capabilities that had preserved and developed the most valuable aspects of imperial organizational expertise while applying them to cultural and religious rather than purely political objectives. The religious devotion that characterized Gudea's approach to governance involved comprehensive temple-building programs that created some of the most impressive religious architecture in Mesopotamian history, while also demonstrating how traditional Sumerian religious values could be revitalized and adapted to address the spiritual and social needs of post-imperial society. The temple complexes that were constructed during his reign combined architectural innovation with traditional religious symbolism in ways that honored established cultural traditions, while also creating new possibilities for religious expression and community participation. The architectural achievements that emerged from these religious building programs included sophisticated engineering innovations that solved complex technical problems while also creating aesthetically beautiful and symbolically meaningful structures that could serve both practical religious functions and broader cultural purposes as demonstrations of community, identity, artistic capability, and spiritual commitment. The advanced irrigation systems, sophisticated ventilation designs, and elaborate decorative programs that characterize these temple projects required coordination of multiple specialized crafts and extensive logistical planning that demonstrated how traditional urban governance could achieve remarkable results when focused on cultural and spiritual rather than military and political objectives. The international diplomacy that Lagash conducted under Gudea's leadership demonstrated how city-states could maintain beneficial relationships with distant communities without the extensive military and administrative apparatus that had characterized imperial approaches to international relations, creating models for peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange that would influence diplomatic development throughout the ancient world. The trade relationships that Lagash established during this period extended from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia, bringing exotic materials and cultural influences that enriched local artistic and intellectual development, while also providing economic benefits that supported the city's remarkable cultural achievements. The cultural exchange that resulted from these diplomatic relationships involved not only commercial transactions, but also intellectual and artistic interactions that preserved and transmitted the most valuable achievements of imperial civilization, while also fostering new forms of cultural synthesis that reflected the opportunities for creative development that had emerged from political decentralization. The artistic styles, literary techniques and religious concepts that developed in Lagash during this period influenced cultural development throughout Mesopotamia, while also contributing to the preservation and transmission of Sumerian cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost during the disruptions of imperial collapse. The Sumerian cultural preservation that became one of Gudea's most important historical contributions involved systematic efforts to maintain and revitalize traditional language, literature, and religious practices that represented the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of Mesopotamian cultural development, creating institutional frameworks and educational programs that could ensure the transmission of essential cultural knowledge to future generations. The scribal schools, religious ceremonies, and artistic workshops that flourished in Lagash during this period established models for cultural continuity that would influence educational and cultural development throughout Mesopotamian history. The political preparation that occurred during Gudea's reign involved the gradual development of governmental and administrative innovations that would provide foundations for the renewed centralization efforts that would emerge in subsequent decades. As the success of Lagash's independent development demonstrated both the continued viability of traditional city-state governance and the potential benefits that could be achieved through larger-scale political coordination that could preserve local autonomy while also providing security and economic advantages that individual cities could not achieve independently. By 2100 BCE, the cultural renaissance that had flourished in Lagash under Gudea's remarkable leadership had created artistic, literary, and religious achievements that would influence Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years, while also demonstrating how human creativity and spiritual devotion could flourish even in the aftermath of political catastrophe, providing both practical models and cultural inspiration that would prove essential for the political and cultural renewal that would soon emerge to create the next great phase of Mesopotamian civilization. The artistic, literary, and religious achievements that had demonstrated how human creativity and spiritual devotion could flourish even in the aftermath of political catastrophe would soon provide both practical models and cultural inspiration that proved essential for the political and cultural renewal that emerged around 2112 BCE. When the lessons learned from both imperial success and imperial failure were systematically applied to create new forms of governmental organization that could preserve the benefits of large-scale political coordination while avoiding the structural weaknesses that had led to Akkadian collapse. The founder of what historians now call the Third Dynasty of Ur was Ur-Nammu, a military leader who had initially served as governor under Utu-Hegel of Uruk, but who possessed the vision and capability to transform the successful resistance against Gutian occupation into a comprehensive program of political reconstruction that would establish the Neo-Sumerian Empire as one of the most sophisticated and well-governed political entities in ancient history. The systematic justice principles that Ur-Nammu established through his revolutionary law code represented humanity's first comprehensive attempt to create legal frameworks that could ensure consistent and equitable treatment for all members of society regardless of their social status, economic position or cultural background, establishing precedents for legal thinking that would influence governmental development throughout the ancient world for thousands of years to come. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating from approximately 2100–2050 BCE, is recognized by modern scholars as the oldest known surviving law code in the world, predating the famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries, and demonstrating legal sophistication that combined practical governmental needs with sophisticated moral and philosophical principles. The prologue to Ur-Nammu's law code reveals sophisticated understanding of both divine authority and royal responsibility, as the king presented his legal innovations not as personal preferences or arbitrary commands, but rather a systematic implementation of divine justice that had been entrusted to him by the gods for the benefit of all his subjects. According to the preserved text, after An and Enlil had turned over the kingship of Ur to Nanna, at that time did Ur-Nammu, son born of Ninsun, for his beloved mother who bore him, in accordance with his principles of equity and truth, establish equity in the land. He banished malediction, violence and strife, demonstrating how royal authority was understood to derive from divine mandate, while also creating expectations for royal behaviour that emphasized justice, protection and prosperity for all subjects. The specific legal provisions that comprised Ur-Nammu's code reflected remarkably enlightened approaches to criminal justice that emphasized compensation and restoration rather than retribution and punishment, creating alternatives to the cycles of vengeance that had often characterized justice systems in earlier periods. Unlike the later Code of Hammurabi, with its famous principle of an eye for an eye, Ur-Nammu's laws typically prescribe monetary fines for physical injuries, allowing injured parties to receive compensation that could help them recover from their losses, while also avoiding the social disruption that could result from systematic mutilation of offenders. The social hierarchy that was reflected in the legal code demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both practical social realities and moral aspirations for equal treatment under law, as the code explicitly stated that the orphan was not delivered up to the rich man, the widow was not delivered up to the mighty man, the man of 1 shekel was not delivered up to the man of 1 mina, establishing principles of legal protection for vulnerable populations that would influence social justice thinking throughout subsequent history, while also recognizing that effective governance required both practical accommodation of existing social differences and systematic efforts to prevent the exploitation of weaker members of society by more powerful individuals. The monumental religious architecture that characterized Ur-Nammu's building programs represented some of the most impressive achievements in ancient Mesopotamian construction, combining sophisticated engineering techniques with profound religious symbolism to create structures that served both practical ceremonial functions and broader cultural purposes as demonstrations of divine favor, royal competence, and community identity that could inspire loyalty and pride among diverse populations. The ziggurats that were constructed during this period reached unprecedented scales and architectural sophistication, with the Great Ziggurat of Ur rising to heights of over 100 feet and incorporating advanced construction techniques that allowed these massive structures to remain stable for thousands of years, despite the challenging environmental conditions of the Mesopotamian floodplain. The administrative excellence that characterized the Third Dynasty of Ur represented the culmination of thousands of years of governmental innovation that had been refined through both successful imperial experience and careful analysis of the factors that had contributed to earlier political failures, creating provincial systems and bureaucratic structures that could maintain effective central coordination while also providing sufficient local autonomy to accommodate regional variations in culture, economy, and traditional governance patterns. The hierarchical administrative structure that emerged during this period involved sophisticated division of authority between central and provincial officials that allowed the Neo-Sumerian state to exercise effective control over territories extending from southeastern Anatolia to the Persian Gulf, while maintaining administrative efficiency and preventing the kind of bureaucratic overstretch that had contributed to Akkadian imperial collapse. The 48-year reign of Shulgi, or Namu's successor, provided the political stability and administrative continuity necessary for implementing comprehensive reforms that would demonstrate the full potential of the governmental innovations that had been pioneered during the early years of the dynasty. Shulgi's extraordinary longevity as ruler allowed him to pursue long-term development projects and systematic policy implementation that would not have been possible under conditions of frequent leadership changes, while his personal capabilities as both administrator and military leader enabled him to expand territorial control while also maintaining internal stability and economic prosperity that benefited all levels of society. The expansion and conquest achievements that characterized Shulgi's reign included not only territorial acquisition through military campaigns, but also sophisticated integration of conquered populations through administrative and cultural policies that could transform potential enemies into productive and loyal subjects of the Neo-Sumerian state. His successful capture of the city of Susa and the surrounding Elamite territories demonstrated military capabilities that rivaled those of the Akkadian Empire at its height, while his administrative integration of these diverse populations showed governmental sophistication that had learned from earlier imperial experiences to create more sustainable approaches to multi-ethnic governance. The standardization programs that Shulgi implemented throughout the empire represented unprecedented achievements in administrative coordination that established uniform weights, measures, calendar systems, and governmental procedures across vast territories that encompassed dozens of different cultural and linguistic groups. These standardization efforts facilitated both commercial activity and administrative efficiency, while also creating shared frameworks for communication and cooperation that could transcend local differences and foster imperial unity without requiring the complete suppression of local traditions and customs. The economic management systems that characterized the Third Dynasty of Ur involved sophisticated balance between state control and private enterprise that reflected both practical understanding of economic principles and careful attention to the social and political implications of different approaches to resource allocation and wealth distribution. The state controlled enormous resources, including agricultural lands, manufacturing workshops, and trade networks, but also provided opportunities for private entrepreneurship and individual economic advancement that could channel personal ambition toward activities that contributed to broader community prosperity. The patrimonial system that organized economic and political relationships throughout the empire created networks of mutual obligation and support that could provide both economic security and social stability for participants, while also ensuring that resources were allocated according to principles that emphasize both efficiency and equity. Under this system, all households throughout the empire were considered dependents of higher-level households, ultimately culminating in the royal household that bore responsibility for the welfare of all subjects, while also possessing authority to coordinate resource allocation and policy implementation on an empire-wide scale. The cultural patronage that flourished under Third Dynasty rule supported remarkable achievements in literature, education, and artistic expression that preserved and developed the greatest accomplishments of earlier Mesopotamian civilizations, while also fostering new forms of cultural innovation that reflected the unprecedented scale and diversity of Neo-Sumerian society. The educational institutions that were established during this period created systematic programs for training administrators, scribes, and religious personnel who possessed both the technical competencies necessary for effective governmental service and the cultural knowledge required to maintain continuity with traditional Mesopotamian intellectual and spiritual achievements. The imperial revival that the Third Dynasty of Ur achieved represented successful application of lessons learned from Akkadian experience, demonstrating how earlier imperial innovations could be preserved and refined while avoiding the structural problems that had led to imperial collapse. The governmental systems that emerged during this period combined the administrative sophistication and territorial scope that had characterized Akkadian success with improved approaches to provincial governance, cultural integration, and resource management that could maintain imperial stability and prosperity over extended periods without the kind of overstretch and popular resistance that had undermined earlier imperial experiments. The very success of the Neo-Sumerian imperial experiment would ultimately create conditions that made the system vulnerable to challenges that even the most sophisticated administrative and military capabilities could not successfully address, as the achievements of the Third Dynasty of Ur had created expectations for governmental performance and resource allocation that became increasingly difficult to sustain when external pressures and internal problems began accumulating during the final decades of the dynasty. By 2050 BCE, the strains that had been building within the imperial system began manifesting themselves in ways that would demonstrate how even the most carefully designed governmental structures could become overwhelmed when multiple challenges converged simultaneously to test the fundamental limits of ancient political organization. The administrative exhaustion that characterized the final phase of Ur-3 rule reflected the inherent limitations of ancient bureaucratic systems that required enormous human resources to maintain the detailed record-keeping, policy implementation, and coordination activities that were necessary for effective imperial governance across such diverse and extensive territories. The thousands of cuneiform tablets that archaeologists have recovered from this period reveal administrative systems of unprecedented complexity and sophistication, but also demonstrate how the very thoroughness of bureaucratic control had created operational costs that consumed ever larger proportions of imperial resources while generating diminishing returns in terms of actual governmental effectiveness and popular satisfaction. The bureaucratic overload that gradually undermined imperial efficiency involved not only the direct costs of maintaining large numbers of administrative personnel, but also the indirect costs that resulted from increasingly complex procedures, overlapping jurisdictions, and communication delays that made it progressively more difficult for central authorities to respond quickly and effectively to local problems and opportunities. The detailed regulations and standardized procedures that had been essential for imperial success during earlier periods began creating rigidities that prevented adaptive responses to changing conditions, while the very comprehensiveness of imperial control made it difficult for local officials to exercise the initiative and flexibility that would have been necessary for addressing unprecedented challenges. The military pressures that increasingly threatened imperial security came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating strategic challenges that stretched imperial military resources beyond their effective capacity and forced imperial authorities to make impossible choices between defending different threatened territories while also maintaining internal order and supporting the economic activities that generated the resources necessary for military operations. The most serious of these external threats came from Amorite infiltration from the western regions and Elamite raids from the eastern territories, creating a two-front strategic situation that would have challenged even the most capable military organization. The Amorite peoples who began pressing against the western boundaries of the Neo-Sumerian Empire during this period were not simple nomadic raiders, but rather organized societies that had been displaced from their traditional territories by climate changes and population pressures, and that possessed both the military capabilities and the cultural sophistication necessary to pose genuine threats to imperial security and territorial integrity. These Amorite groups included skilled warriors, experienced administrators, and cultural leaders who understood both the weaknesses of the imperial system and the opportunities that could be exploited through systematic pressure on imperial boundaries and internal populations. The infiltration processes through which Amorite populations gradually penetrated imperial territory involved not only military incursions but also peaceful settlement, intermarriage with local populations, and participation in imperial economic activities that allowed Amorite communities to establish themselves within the empire while maintaining cultural identities and political loyalties that could potentially be mobilized against imperial authority if circumstances created opportunities for independence or rebellion. This gradual demographic transformation created internal security challenges that could not be addressed through traditional military responses while also generating cultural and political tensions that complicated efforts to maintain imperial unity and loyalty among diverse populations. The Elamite raids that intensified during the final decades of Ur III rule represented systematic military campaigns conducted by sophisticated political entities that possessed both the military capabilities necessary for successful attacks on imperial territory and the strategic understanding required to exploit imperial weaknesses and coordinate their activities. With internal rebellions and external pressures that could maximize the effectiveness of their military interventions, the Elamites had learned from earlier conflicts with Mesopotamian powers to develop military techniques and political strategies that could neutralize the advantages that imperial armies had traditionally possessed through superior organization and equipment. The economic troubles that accelerated imperial decline reflected both the mounting costs of addressing multiple simultaneous challenges and the disruption of the commercial and agricultural systems that had provided the economic foundation for imperial prosperity and governmental operations. Inflation became a serious problem as imperial authorities were forced to increase tax collection and monetary creation to fund military operations and administrative activities, while agricultural disruption caused by military conflicts and climate fluctuations reduced the food supplies that were essential for maintaining urban populations and supporting the specialized occupations that had characterized imperial civilization. The agricultural disruption that contributed to economic crisis involved both direct damage from military conflicts and indirect effects from the climate changes that had begun affecting the region during this period, creating conditions that reduced agricultural productivity while also increasing the costs of maintaining the irrigation systems that were essential for Mesopotamian farming. The sophisticated hydraulic engineering that had been one of the greatest achievements of Mesopotamian civilization required constant maintenance and periodic reconstruction that became increasingly difficult to finance and organize as imperial resources were diverted toward military activities and crisis management. The inflation and monetary problems that characterized this period reflected both the practical challenges of maintaining stable currency systems under conditions of military and political stress, and the broader economic disruptions that resulted from reduced productivity, increased governmental expenditures, and declining confidence in imperial stability and competence. The standardized weights and measures that had facilitated commercial activity throughout the empire began losing their effectiveness as local communities developed alternative systems for economic exchange that could function independently of imperial coordination and oversight. The destruction of Ur that occurred around 2004 BCE represented not only military defeat, but also the culmination of a systematic process of imperial dissolution that had been developing over several decades as internal problems and external pressures gradually overwhelmed the governmental and military capabilities that had maintained imperial unity and prosperity during earlier periods. The Elamite conquest that ended the Third Dynasty of Ur was facilitated by the internal weaknesses and popular disaffection that had reduced imperial military effectiveness and created opportunities for external enemies to exploit imperial vulnerabilities through coordinated attacks that the weakened imperial forces could not successfully repel. The royal captivity that befell Ibisin, the last king of Ur III, symbolized not only the personal tragedy of imperial collapse, but also the broader cultural and political catastrophe that resulted when the governmental institutions and cultural achievements that had been developed over centuries were suddenly destroyed or disrupted by military conquest and political fragmentation. The capture and deportation of the royal family represented the complete breakdown of the political legitimacy and institutional continuity that had provided the foundation for imperial authority and social cohesion throughout the Neo-Sumerian period. The cultural mourning that followed the fall of Ur found expression in some of the most emotionally powerful literature in ancient Mesopotamian cultural tradition, as poets and scribes created lamentations that preserved both historical memory of imperial achievement and cultural understanding of the forces that could destroy even the most sophisticated civilizations when conditions aligned against them. These lamentation texts reveal sophisticated understanding of both the practical factors that had contributed to imperial collapse and the broader philosophical and theological questions about the relationship between human achievement and divine authority that had been raised by the dramatic reversal of imperial fortune. The historical memory that was preserved through these literary works established narrative frameworks and cultural understanding that would influence Mesopotamian political thinking for thousands of years, creating both models for imperial achievement and warnings about the dangers that could threaten even the most successful governmental systems when they failed to adapt effectively to changing conditions or when they overextended their capabilities beyond sustainable limits. The Amorite integration that followed the collapse of Ur III represented not simple conquest or replacement, but rather complex processes of cultural synthesis and political adaptation that would gradually transform Mesopotamian civilization while preserving many of its most valuable achievements and traditions. The Amorite peoples who established themselves throughout the former imperial territory brought their own cultural traditions and governmental practices, but also adopted many aspects of Mesopotamian civilization that they recognized as superior to their own traditional approaches to urban governance, religious organization, and intellectual development. The nomadic peoples who settled in Mesopotamian cities during this transition period gradually adapted to urban life, while also contributing their own innovations in military organization, commercial practices, and political leadership that would enrich and transform Mesopotamian civilization in ways that prepared it for the next great phase of cultural and political development. The Amorite dynasties that emerged during this period established governmental approaches that combined traditional Mesopotamian administrative expertise with innovations in political organization that reflected both Amorite cultural values and practical lessons learned from the successes and failures of earlier imperial experiments. The transition toward the Old Babylonian era that began during this period would ultimately demonstrate how cultural and political traditions could survive even catastrophic institutional collapse to provide foundations for renewed civilization that could achieve greater stability and more sustainable prosperity through systematic application of accumulated historical wisdom to the challenges and opportunities of changing political and cultural environments. The cultural and political traditions that had demonstrated such remarkable resilience throughout the cycles of imperial rise and collapse had been supported and enabled by equally revolutionary developments in technology, engineering, and scientific understanding that transformed not only the material capabilities available to Mesopotamian societies, but also the fundamental ways that human beings could interact with their physical environment and organize their productive activities to support increasingly complex and sophisticated forms of civilization. The 5 centuries from 2500 to 2000 BCE witnessed technological achievements that would provide the practical foundation for all subsequent developments in human material culture. The metallurgical advances that characterized this period represented quantum leaps in both theoretical understanding and practical application of principles that governed the extraction, refinement, and working of metals that could provide tools and weapons far superior to anything that could be achieved using stone, wood, or other traditional materials. The sophisticated bronze working that emerged during this period involved not only improved techniques for combining copper and tin in optimal proportions, but also innovative approaches to casting, forging, and finishing that could create objects of unprecedented strength, durability, and aesthetic beauty while also making possible entirely new forms of artistic expression and technological capability. The smelting technologies that made advanced bronze production possible required sophisticated understanding of temperature control, chemical composition, and metallurgical principles that pushed ancient scientific knowledge toward increasingly systematic and accurate understanding of natural phenomena and their practical applications. The furnace designs that were developed during this period could achieve and maintain temperatures that had been impossible with earlier technologies, while new techniques for ore preparation and alloy composition allowed metalworkers to create bronze products with precisely controlled characteristics that could be optimized for specific applications ranging from delicate jewelry to massive architectural components. The tool and weapon innovations that resulted from these metallurgical advances transformed virtually every aspect of productive activity throughout Mesopotamian society, from agricultural implements that could increase farming efficiency and productivity, to construction tools that made possible more ambitious architectural projects, to weapons and armor that revolutionized military tactics and strategic capabilities. The bronze plows, axes, hammers, and cutting implements that became available during this period allowed craftsmen and farmers to accomplish tasks that would have been impossible using earlier technologies, while also reducing the time and effort required for essential productive activities. The transportation innovations that emerged during this period created entirely new possibilities for moving people and goods across the extensive territories that characterized mature Mesopotamian civilization, making possible the commercial, military, and cultural exchanges that had been essential for imperial success, while also facilitating the international connections that brought exotic materials and foreign ideas into Mesopotamian cultural development. The wheel technology that had been pioneered during earlier periods was refined and elaborated during this era to create vehicles that were better adapted to different types of terrain and cargo requirements, while new techniques for road construction and maintenance created infrastructure that could support regular transportation across vast distances. The wheeled vehicles that reached technological maturity during this period included not only simple carts and wagons for local transportation, but also specialized designs for different purposes, including military chariots that could provide tactical advantages on battlefields, ceremonial vehicles that could serve symbolic functions in religious and political ceremonies, and commercial transport systems that could handle the logistical requirements of long-distance trade relationships. The engineering principles that were developed for vehicle construction influenced subsequent technological development in many other fields, establishing basic concepts about mechanical advantage, structural stability, and materials optimization that would prove applicable to diverse technological challenges. The sailing technology that was perfected during this period opened up entirely new dimensions of transportation and communication that connected Mesopotamian civilizations with distant cultures throughout the Persian Gulf, Mediterranean Sea, and beyond, creating possibilities for cultural exchange and commercial development that had been unimaginable using only land-based transportation systems. The sailing vessels that were constructed during this era incorporated sophisticated understanding of hydrodynamics, wind patterns, and navigation principles that allowed merchants and travelers to undertake journeys that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive using earlier technologies. The agricultural intensification that was achieved through improved irrigation engineering represented some of the most remarkable technological achievements of the Bronze Age, as hydraulic engineers developed water management systems that could support much larger populations, while also increasing agricultural productivity and reliability throughout regions that had previously been marginal for farming activities. The complex irrigation networks that were constructed during this period included not only basic canals and distribution channels, but also sophisticated control systems involving locks, dams, reservoirs, and drainage systems that could optimize water usage while preventing the soil salinization and waterlogging problems that had limited agricultural expansion during earlier periods. The engineering principles that were developed for irrigation projects required advanced understanding of surveying techniques, hydraulic mathematics, and soil science that pushed ancient scientific knowledge toward greater precision and systematic understanding of natural phenomena and their practical applications. The construction projects that were necessary for creating these irrigation systems required coordination of thousands of workers over extended periods, fostering innovations in project management, quality control, and logistical planning that would prove valuable for many other types of large-scale construction activities. The urban sophistication that characterized mature Bronze Age cities reflected both the technological capabilities that made complex urban environments possible and the social innovations that were necessary for organizing and governing large populations that were engaged in increasingly specialized and interdependent economic activities. The cities that reached their full development during this period incorporated advanced architectural techniques, infrastructure systems, and urban planning principles that created living environments that were not only functional and efficient, but also aesthetically pleasing and culturally meaningful for their diverse inhabitants. The larger cities that emerged during this period could support populations that numbered in the tens of thousands, while maintaining standards of public health, safety, and convenience that had been impossible in smaller communities using earlier technologies. The advanced planning that was necessary for these urban environments required sophisticated understanding of engineering principles, social dynamics, and resource management that pushed ancient governmental and administrative capabilities toward greater complexity and effectiveness. The social mobility that became possible within these technologically advanced societies created new opportunities for individual advancement and cultural participation that had been unavailable in simpler social systems, as the specialized occupations and professional categories that emerged during this period allowed people with particular talents and interests to develop expertise and achieve recognition in ways that could transcend traditional limitations based on family background or social origin. The merchant classes and professional specialists who flourished during this era contributed both practical capabilities and cultural innovations that enriched Mesopotamian civilization, while also creating more diverse and dynamic social environments. The cultural exchange that was facilitated by improved transportation and communication technologies created international connections that brought exotic goods, innovative techniques, and fresh ideas into Mesopotamian cultural development, while also spreading Mesopotamian achievements throughout the broader ancient world. The influence of Bronze Age Mesopotamian technological and cultural innovations can be traced through subsequent developments in Egypt, the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and regions as distant as Europe and East Asia, demonstrating how technological advancement could create possibilities for human development and cultural exchange that transcended traditional geographical and cultural boundaries. By 2000 BCE, the technological revolution that had transformed human capabilities throughout the Bronze Age had established the practical foundations that would support all subsequent developments in civilization, creating tool technologies, transportation systems, agricultural techniques, and urban infrastructure that would influence human development for thousands of years, while also establishing principles of scientific understanding and technological innovation that would provide the basis for continued advancement in human material capabilities and cultural achievement throughout the ancient world and beyond. The practical foundations that had been established through the technological revolution of the Bronze Age created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual and spiritual development that would demonstrate how human consciousness itself could evolve and expand when supported by the material prosperity and social stability that advanced technology had made possible, as the increased productivity and organizational capabilities that characterized mature Mesopotamian civilization freed significant portions of the population from the immediate demands of physical survival to pursue the kinds of abstract thinking, systematic inquiry, and creative expression that would establish intellectual frameworks and spiritual insights capable of addressing the fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and human purpose that had challenged thoughtful individuals since the beginning of conscious awareness. The theological sophistication that emerged during this remarkable period of intellectual development represented systematic attempts to understand the relationship between divine and human realms through comprehensive mythologies and religious philosophies that combined centuries of accumulated spiritual experience with increasingly sophisticated modes of abstract thinking and symbolic analysis that could address complex questions about cosmic order, moral responsibility, and the ultimate purposes that governed both individual lives and collective human development. The systematic mythology that reached its mature form during these centuries established narrative frameworks and conceptual structures that would influence religious thinking throughout the ancient world and continue to resonate in contemporary spiritual traditions that seek to understand humanity's place within larger cosmic realities. The creation myths that were refined and systematized during this period provided sophisticated explanations for the origins of the physical universe, the emergence of conscious life, and the development of human civilization that combined careful observation of natural phenomena with profound spiritual insights about the relationships between order and chaos, creativity and destruction, divine purpose and human freedom that continue to challenge philosophical and theological thinking even today. The Enuma Elish and other Mesopotamian creation narratives established literary and conceptual patterns that would influence subsequent religious traditions throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, demonstrating how spiritual wisdom could be preserved and transmitted through narrative forms that combined emotional appeal with intellectual sophistication. The astronomical mastery that characterized Mesopotamian intellectual achievement during this period reflected both practical needs for accurate calendar systems that could coordinate agricultural activities and religious ceremonies, and genuine scientific curiosity about the celestial phenomena that provided clues to understanding the mathematical principles and natural laws that governed cosmic processes beyond direct human experience. The systematic observations that Mesopotamian astronomers conducted over many generations created databases of astronomical information that would provide the foundation for mathematical astronomy throughout the ancient world, while also establishing observational techniques and theoretical frameworks that would influence scientific development for thousands of years. The calendar systems that emerged from this astronomical work represented remarkable achievements in mathematical calculation and practical organization that could coordinate complex social activities across vast territories while maintaining accuracy over extended periods despite the inherent complications that resulted from the fact that lunar months and solar years did not divide evenly into simple numerical relationships. The lunisolar calendars that Mesopotamian astronomers developed required sophisticated understanding of cyclical patterns and mathematical relationships that pushed ancient mathematical capabilities toward greater precision and theoretical sophistication, while also creating practical tools that could serve essential social and religious functions. The celestial prediction capabilities that developed alongside calendar construction demonstrated how systematic observation and mathematical analysis could reveal patterns in natural phenomena that appeared random or mysterious to casual observation, establishing methodological principles for scientific inquiry that emphasize the importance of careful data collection, mathematical modeling, and predictive testing that would prove essential for all subsequent scientific development throughout human history. The ability to predict eclipses, planetary movements, and seasonal changes provided both practical benefits for agricultural and religious planning and profound insights into the mathematical order that governed natural phenomena. The medical knowledge that accumulated during this period represented humanity's first systematic attempts to understand health, disease, and healing through approaches that combined empirical observation with theoretical frameworks that could provide explanations for physiological processes and therapeutic interventions that went beyond simple trial-and-error experimentation or purely supernatural explanations for illness and recovery. The diagnostic texts that were created during this era established medical vocabularies and analytical categories that could distinguish between different types of ailments, while also providing systematic approaches to treatment that reflected both practical experience and theoretical understanding of the relationships between symptoms, causes, and effective remedies. The treatment methods that were developed during this period included not only pharmaceutical approaches using various plant and mineral substances, but also surgical procedures, dietary recommendations, and environmental modifications that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the multiple factors that could influence health and recovery, while also establishing therapeutic principles that emphasize the importance of addressing underlying causes rather than merely alleviating symptoms. The medical literature that has been preserved from this period reveals remarkable diagnostic sophistication that could identify specific conditions and recommend appropriate treatments based on systematic classification of symptoms and therapeutic outcomes. The mathematical innovations that reached unprecedented sophistication during this period established computational techniques and geometric principles that would provide the foundation for all subsequent mathematical development throughout the ancient world, while also demonstrating how abstract mathematical thinking could reveal universal patterns and relationships that apply to diverse phenomena ranging from architectural design to astronomical calculation to commercial transactions. The advanced geometry that Mesopotamian mathematicians developed included sophisticated understanding of area calculation, volume measurement, and proportional relationships that made possible the architectural and engineering achievements that characterized mature Mesopotamian civilization. The calculation systems that were refined during this period incorporated both practical arithmetic techniques for everyday commercial and administrative applications and advanced mathematical methods for complex problems involving astronomical computation, architectural planning, and engineering design that required precision and theoretical sophistication far beyond the needs of simple commercial transactions. The sexagesimal number system that was perfected during this era provided computational capabilities that would influence mathematical development throughout the ancient world and continue to affect modern systems for measuring time and angular relationships. The literary maturation that characterized this period of intellectual achievement produced epic poetry and wisdom, literature that combined entertainment value with profound philosophical exploration of fundamental questions about human nature, social responsibility, divine authority, and the meaning of individual existence within larger cosmic and social contexts that challenged readers to think deeply about their own lives and relationships, while also preserving cultural values and historical memories that connected contemporary communities with their ancestral traditions and accumulated wisdom. The epic poetry that reached its mature form during these centuries established narrative techniques, character development strategies, and thematic explorations that would influence literary development throughout the ancient world, while also creating works of lasting artistic and intellectual value that continue to speak to contemporary readers about universal human concerns that transcend specific cultural and historical contexts. The Epic of Gilgamesh and other Mesopotamian literary masterpieces demonstrated how skilled poets could combine exciting adventure narratives with sophisticated psychological analysis and philosophical reflection to create works that function simultaneously as entertainment, education, and spiritual guidance. The wisdom literature that flourished alongside epic poetry provided systematic exploration of practical ethics, social relationships, and personal development that reflected both accumulated cultural experience and sophisticated thinking about how individuals could live meaningful and productive lives within complex social environments that required balance between personal fulfillment and community responsibilities. These wisdom texts established literary forms and philosophical approaches that would influence intellectual development throughout the ancient world, while also preserving practical knowledge about human psychology and social dynamics that remains relevant for contemporary readers. The educational systems that supported these intellectual achievements represented unprecedented developments in systematic knowledge transmission that created institutional frameworks for preserving, developing, and disseminating the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization, while also training new generations of scholars, administrators, and cultural leaders who could continue advancing human intellectual capabilities and cultural sophistication. The scribal schools that reached their full development during this period established educational principles and pedagogical methods that would influence learning throughout the ancient world, while also creating social institutions that could maintain intellectual continuity across generations despite political changes and social disruptions. The standardized curriculum that characterized mature educational systems included not only basic literacy and numerical skills, but also advanced training in literature, law, religion, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine that could prepare students for specialized professional roles while also providing comprehensive cultural education that enabled educated individuals to participate fully in the intellectual and spiritual life of their communities. The educational methods that were developed during this period emphasized both memorization of essential knowledge and critical thinking skills that could enable students to apply their learning creatively to new situations and challenges that required intellectual flexibility and innovative problem-solving capabilities. By 2000 BCE, the intellectual achievements that had emerged during this remarkable period of human development had established frameworks for systematic thinking about natural phenomena, social organization, moral responsibility, and spiritual development that would provide the foundation for all subsequent intellectual and cultural advancement throughout the ancient world, demonstrating how human consciousness could evolve toward greater sophistication and understanding when supported by the material prosperity and social stability that advanced civilization could provide for those fortunate enough to participate in its benefits and opportunities. The intellectual frameworks and cultural institutions that had reached such remarkable sophistication during the final centuries of Sumerian ascendancy would prove to be among humanity's most enduring achievements, establishing patterns of thought, social organization, and creative expression that would continue to influence human development long after the political entities that had created them had disappeared from the historical stage, demonstrating how the most profound human accomplishments transcend the particular circumstances of their creation to become permanent components of human consciousness and cultural capability that enrich and enable all subsequent generations who inherit the accumulated wisdom and practical knowledge that earlier civilizations had developed through their struggles to understand existence and create meaningful forms of collective life. The foundational innovations that emerged from Mesopotamian civilization between 6000 and 2000 BCE represent perhaps the most concentrated period of fundamental invention in human history, establishing the basic technologies, institutional structures, and conceptual frameworks that would provide the foundation for all subsequent civilized development throughout human history. The invention of writing systems that could preserve and transmit complex information across time and distance created possibilities for human intellectual development that had been unimaginable during earlier periods when knowledge was limited to what individuals could remember and pass on through oral traditions, while the development of urban organization principles demonstrated how large numbers of people could live together productively in concentrated settlements that could support specialized occupations and sophisticated cultural activities. The creation of systematic legal frameworks that could ensure justice and maintain social order within increasingly complex communities established governmental principles that would influence political development throughout the ancient world and continue to shape contemporary legal thinking about the proper relationship between individual rights and community responsibilities, while the emergence of professional administrative institutions demonstrated how systematic bureaucratic organization could coordinate complex collective activities across vast territories and diverse populations in ways that had never before been attempted or achieved. The cultural contributions that emerged from Sumerian civilization established artistic, literary, and intellectual traditions that would enrich human experience for thousands of years, while also demonstrating how creative expression could serve both aesthetic and educational purposes by preserving cultural values, exploring philosophical questions, and providing emotional satisfaction that could enhance the quality of individual and community life beyond the mere satisfaction of material needs. The literary masterpieces that were created during this period established narrative techniques, character development strategies, and thematic explorations that continue to influence creative writing throughout the world, while the artistic achievements in sculpture, architecture, and decorative arts demonstrated how skilled craftsmen could combine technical mastery with aesthetic vision to create works of lasting beauty and cultural significance. The religious and philosophical traditions that developed during this period provided systematic approaches to fundamental questions about divine authority, moral responsibility, and the meaning of human existence that established theological frameworks and spiritual practices that would influence religious development throughout the ancient world, while also creating institutional structures for communal worship and individual spiritual development that could provide both social cohesion and personal meaning for people seeking to understand their place within larger cosmic realities, the scientific and mathematical achievements that characterize Mesopotamian intellectual development created analytical methods and theoretical frameworks that would provide the foundation for systematic inquiry into natural phenomena throughout the ancient world, establishing observational techniques, mathematical tools, and conceptual approaches that would prove essential for all subsequent scientific advancement, while also demonstrating how careful study of natural patterns could reveal universal principles that applied across diverse phenomena and geographical contexts. The social organization principles that were developed during this period established institutional patterns for class relationships, professional specialization, and economic coordination that would influence social development throughout the ancient world, while also creating practical models for managing the complex relationships between individual ambition and community welfare that characterize all advanced societies. The professional institutions that emerged during this period created career opportunities and social roles that allowed individuals with particular talents and interests to develop specialized expertise while contributing to broader community prosperity and cultural advancement. The technological inheritance that subsequent civilizations received from Mesopotamian innovation included not only specific tools and techniques, but also methodological approaches to problem-solving and systematic thinking about how human ingenuity could be applied to practical challenges that had previously seemed insurmountable, establishing principles of technological development that emphasized both individual creativity and collaborative organization that would prove essential for continued advancement in human material capabilities and productive efficiency. The intellectual frameworks that were established during this period created systematic approaches to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other fields of inquiry that provided both practical tools for addressing immediate needs and theoretical foundations for continued intellectual development that could expand human understanding of natural phenomena and social relationships in ways that would benefit all subsequent generations who inherited these accumulated insights and analytical capabilities. The influence that Mesopotamian achievements had on successor civilizations can be traced through thousands of years of subsequent development throughout the Mediterranean world, Central Asia, and beyond, as the governmental institutions, legal principles, religious concepts, artistic techniques, literary forms, and scientific methods that were pioneered in ancient Mesopotamia were adopted, adapted, and further developed by Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, and Islamic civilizations that recognized the value of Mesopotamian innovations, while also contributing their own creative additions to the accumulated treasury of human knowledge and cultural achievement. The Babylonian inheritance of Mesopotamian legal and administrative traditions established governmental continuity that preserved and developed Sumerian institutional innovations while adapting them to changing political and social conditions, demonstrating how cultural achievements could transcend particular political entities to provide foundations for continued civilizational development, even when original creators had disappeared from the historical stage. The Assyrian adoption of Mesopotamian military and administrative techniques enabled empire building on an unprecedented scale, while preserving educational institutions and intellectual traditions that maintained continuity with earlier cultural achievements. The Persian integration of Mesopotamian governmental and cultural traditions within their vast multicultural empire demonstrated how the practical wisdom and institutional innovations that had been developed in ancient Mesopotamia could be successfully applied to political challenges that extended far beyond their original geographical and cultural contexts. While Greek philosophical and scientific development was profoundly influenced by mathematical, astronomical, and theological concepts that had been pioneered by Mesopotamian scholars and preserved through institutional continuity that maintained intellectual traditions across centuries of political change. The modern connections between contemporary civilization and ancient Mesopotamian achievement have been revealed through archaeological discoveries that have recovered vast quantities of written material and physical artifacts that provide unprecedented insights into the daily life, intellectual development, and cultural sophistication of these early civilizations, demonstrating how many aspects of contemporary life have historical roots that extend back thousands of years to the foundational period of human civilizational development that occurred in ancient Mesopotamia between 6000 and 2000 BCE. The archaeological revelations that continue to emerge from excavations throughout Iraq, Syria, and neighboring regions provide ongoing discoveries that expand our understanding of ancient Mesopotamian achievement, while also revealing previously unknown aspects of early human cultural development that demonstrate the remarkable sophistication and creativity that characterize these earliest experiments in civilized living. The cuneiform tablets that have been recovered from ancient libraries and archives preserve vast quantities of information about legal proceedings, commercial transactions, religious ceremonies, literary compositions, scientific observations, and daily life activities that provide detailed insights into how these ancient communities functioned and what values and beliefs guided their development. The contemporary relevance of Mesopotamian achievements extends far beyond historical curiosity to encompass practical insights about governance, social organization, legal principles, educational methods, and cultural development that remain applicable to modern challenges and opportunities, demonstrating how the wisdom that was accumulated through thousands of years of human experimentation with civilized living continues to provide valuable guidance for contemporary efforts to create just, prosperous, and meaningful forms of collective life. The timeless themes that were first systematically explored in Mesopotamian literature and philosophy continue to challenge and inspire contemporary thinkers who wrestle with fundamental questions about governance and justice, individual freedom and social responsibility, the meaning of mortality and the possibility of transcendence, and the proper relationship between human ambition and natural limits that have characterized thoughtful reflection about human existence since the beginning of recorded history. The Epic of Gilgamesh continues to speak to contemporary readers about friendship, ambition, mortality, and the search for meaning, while Mesopotamian legal codes and governmental institutions provide historical precedents for contemporary efforts to balance individual rights with community welfare. The human continuity that connects contemporary civilization with ancient Mesopotamian achievement demonstrates how cultural development represents a cumulative process in which each generation inherits the accumulated wisdom and practical knowledge of their predecessors, while also contributing their own innovations and insights to the growing treasury of human understanding and capability that benefits all subsequent generations who participate in the ongoing project of creating meaningful and productive forms of collective life. The eternal river of human achievement that began flowing in the fertile valleys of ancient Mesopotamia continues to carry forward the accumulated wisdom, practical knowledge, and creative insights that enable each new generation to build upon the foundations that were established by those remarkable pioneers who first discovered how human communities could transcend the immediate demands of physical survival to create forms of collective life that could support the full development of human intellectual, artistic, and spiritual capabilities. As you rest tonight, carried gently towards sleep by these ancient stories of human achievement and cultural development, remember that you are part of this continuing flow of human consciousness and creativity that began nearly 8,000 years ago when our ancestors first learned to plant seeds in river mud, press written symbols into clay tablets, and build cities that could house the dreams and aspirations of thousands of souls working together toward common purposes that transcended individual limitations to achieve collective accomplishments that continue to enrich and inspire human experience throughout all the generations that have followed in their footsteps, and all those yet to come who will inherit the gifts of wisdom, beauty, and practical knowledge that these ancient civilizations discovered and preserved for the benefit of all humanity throughout the endless centuries of human development that stretch ahead toward horizons we can barely imagine, but that remain forever connected to the eternal wellspring of human creativity and hope that first bubbled up from the ancient soil of Mesopotamia to nourish the growth of everything we recognize and cherish as civilization itself.